Welcome to StorySeeker, exploring the world, one story at a time. Today, let's listen to Great Expectations, Charles Dickens' story of Pip, an orphan with big dreams, and his journey of growth through struggles and hope. My name is Pip. That's not what's written on any official record, mind you. My full name is Philip Pirrip. But when I was just a tiny child, I couldn't pronounce it properly. All I managed was Pip. And Pip, I have remained ever since. I never knew my parents. They died too early for me to remember them. The only glimpse I had of them came from the weathered letters carved into their headstones, lined up in a forgotten corner of the village churchyard, surrounded by wind, moss, and silence. One dreary grey afternoon, I stood there just a little boy in coarse clothes and heavy boots, staring at those graves. My father's name, Pirrip, etched in solemn stone. My mother, Georgiana, mentioned below. Next to them, 5 small gravestones for 5 siblings I never met. I imagined them all lying side by side beneath the cold earth, their tiny hands forever still. Around me stretched the marshes wide, flat, lonely. Wind swept in from the sea, sharp and damp. The sky hung low and heavy, like a ceiling about to collapse. And beyond the horizon, the river, the farthest ships, the unknown. That's when it happened. A rough voice tore through the stillness. And suddenly, a man leapt from behind a gravestone. He was filthy, wild-looking, soaked to the bone, with iron shackles still clamped around his leg. His face was pale and fierce, his clothes in tatters, his whole body shaking as though from cold or rage. In one quick move, he grabbed me and flipped me upside down as if checking me for coins or food. "Tell me your name," he growled. I was too frightened to cry. "Pip," I whispered. "Show me where you live," he ordered next, glancing around like a hunted beast. I pointed toward the distant cluster of roofs, barely visible through the mist. "Over there, with my sister and Joe. He's a blacksmith." The man glared at me. "Bring me food," he hissed. "And a file. You hear me, boy? Tomorrow morning, right here, or I'll tear your heart and liver out and roast them for my supper." I could only nod, trembling so hard I could barely stand. "And don't think of telling anyone," he added, "because I've got a friend, a young one, fiercer than me, hiding out here in the marshes. If you breathe a word, he'll know, he'll find you, and you'll wish you hadn't been born." Then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he vanished into the mist. I ran home, my little boots thudding against the damp earth, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I had no idea who that man really was, or what role he would come to play in my life. But I knew, even then, that something had shifted, that the world I thought I knew had opened a darker door. And all of it began on a cold evening. In the marshes, among the dead. I stumbled through the marshes, legs trembling, heart pounding like a hammer inside my chest. Behind me, the grey sky pressed low and heavy, and somewhere in the distance, the prisoner's growling voice still echoed in my ears. My head was full of iron shackles, hungry eyes, and threats whispered among the gravestones. By the time I reached home, dusk had settled. Our cottage stood alone at the edge of the marsh, a crooked little house with whitewashed walls, a slanted roof, and a yard that seemed always full of wind and mud. As I stepped through the door, the warmth of the kitchen hit me like a wave. But so did my sister's voice. "Where have you been, Pip?" she barked, arms akimbo, her red face flushed from the oven heat. "Gone gallivanting again, have you? What did I tell you about wandering off like a stray pup?" Mrs. Joe Gargery, that was my sister's full title. and she never let me forget it. She wore her apron like armor and wielded her wooden spoon like a weapon. Tall, bony, and fierce as a thunderstorm, she had raised me by hand, her favorite phrase, which, in practice, meant I was often raised by slaps and scolds. I mumbled something about just walking a bit, but she didn't care for explanations. "Don't answer back," she snapped. "Go clean those boots, they're caked in marsh filth." Joe, my brother-in-law, was sitting quietly by the hearth, sipping tea, his fair hair glowing in the firelight. Joe was a blacksmith, broad-shouldered and gentle-eyed, a giant of a man with the soul of a child. Though married to my sister, he was more my friend than anything else. And in a house where love was scarce, Joe's kindness was the warmest light I knew. He gave me a small smile, as if to say, "Don't worry, old chap." But he didn't speak. He rarely did. When my sister was in one of her tempers, dinner was a modest affair. Bread, cheese, a bit of pork, but to me it looked like a feast. I sat at the table, trying to seem casual, though my mind raced with a thief's calculations. What could I sneak away with? What wouldn't be missed? I needed food for the man in the marshes, and a file, yes, a blacksmith's file, to saw through those shackles. "Mrs. Joe," I said, voice as sweet as treacle, "what's for breakfast tomorrow?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why do you care?" "Oh, just wondering. I thought I might wake early and help Joe in the forge." She snorted. "You? Help? You'd set your hair on fire before you struck a nail straight. Now hush up and eat." After supper, I washed the dishes under her sharp eye and pretended not to be watching the pantry. I needed to act fast, but not yet. The timing had to be perfect. When night fell, Joe lit his pipe, and I sat close to the fire, pretending to read. But I couldn't focus on the words. The man's voice haunted me still. "Tear out your liver," he'd said. "Roast it." The wind howled outside, and I shivered, though the fire blazed strong. At last, the house grew quiet. Joe's pipe went out. My sister locked up the doors, muttering about criminals and boys who grew up into worse ones. She snuffed the candles, one by one, and then darkness. I lay in bed, fully clothed, listening to the silence. My sister snored faintly in the next room. Joe's breath was slow and peaceful. The house creaked now and then, as old houses do. I waited, and when the time felt right, I slipped from under the blanket, barefoot on the cold floor. I moved like a mouse, careful not to wake anyone. In the pantry, I found a crust of bread, a bit of cheese, some cold pork, and jackpot, a bottle of brandy. I wrapped it all in a cloth. Then, heart pounding, I crept to the forge. There, among the tools and ash, I found what I needed. A file, rough and sharp. I held it in my hand like it was a sword, or a promise, or a sin. I had become a thief, not for myself, not for greed, but for a man whose eyes had burned into mine like fire in the fog. A man in chains, a man who had threatened to kill me. And in the cold night, with that bundle in my arms, I knew only one thing. I had to go back to the marsh. Before the first light of morning, I slipped out the door like a shadow. The cold air bit at my cheeks. The earth beneath my feet was frozen stiff, and the sky was still black with night. The village slept as I crept past empty cottages and dark fields, clutching my little bundle of stolen food and the rough blacksmith's file in my coat. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The marshes stretched before me like a silent sea. Mist rolled low over the ground, curling around my ankles, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. Every bush looked like a crouching man. Every ripple in the mud made me jump. But I kept walking, step by step, drawn forward by a terrible promise. I was shaking partly from cold, partly from fear, and partly from the weight of what I was doing. I had stolen from my sister. I had broken into Joe's forge. I was helping a convict escape justice. And yet, a part of me also pitied him, that wild-eyed man with his iron chain and starving belly. I followed the same path as the day before, my boots squelching in the mud. The fog grew thicker the closer I got to the river. Soon I could hardly see a few feet ahead. That's when I saw him, slumped behind a low embankment. Just as he'd said, he looked even more wretched. In the pale light, dirtier, colder, and more like an animal than a man. He sprang up when he saw me, snatching the bundle from my arms and tearing it open like a wolf. Bread disappeared into his mouth before I could blink. "Did you bring the file?" He grunted between mouthfuls. I nodded and handed it over. He snatched it, dropped to the ground, and began sawing at the iron on his leg with feverish desperation. The sound of metal scraping filled the air, harsh and hollow. I stood nearby, shifting from foot to foot, not sure if I should speak, not sure if I wanted to. But suddenly, he stopped and looked up at me, his mouth still full. "What's in the bottle?" he asked. "Brandy," I said. He took a swig and coughed violently, then gave a toothless grin. "Good boy," he muttered, his voice softer now. "You've got the heart of a man. That you do." But just as he turned back to his work, something caught his eye. He froze, narrowed his eyes, and hissed. "Him? Him who?" I asked, confused. "There's another one," he growled, pointing into the mist. "A young one. I saw him last night, hiding, watching me." He dropped the bottle and ran fast, too fast for someone half-starved and chained. I followed, instinct more than reason driving me. We scrambled over a small ridge and through a gully of twisted grass, and there, lying against a stone, still as death, was another man. He was dressed much the same, though thinner, and his face was darker, crueler. I couldn't tell if he was asleep, unconscious, or pretending, but the first man snarled like a dog. "It's him," he spat. "The one who meant to betray me. He's been hiding in these marshes, waiting for a ship. I'll see him rot first." The man on the ground didn't move. My companion stood over him, fists clenched, breathing like a storm. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I stood there, too stunned to move. Then, as if remembering I was there, the man turned to me. "You saw nothing," he said. "Understand?" I nodded, and with that, he returned to his file, his bread, and his chain. The marshes swallowed the fog again, and I, Pip, just a boy with a stolen heart, turned back toward home, not yet knowing that this moment, this meeting of two desperate men, would haunt my life forever. Christmas Day arrived, not with joy or laughter, but with a weight in my chest heavier than the morning frost. I had returned home from the marshes just before sunrise, clothes soaked, boots muddy, and heart pounding with the guilt of theft and conspiracy. My sister was already bustling in the kitchen, clanging pots and pans, barking orders at Joe, and lamenting loudly how much work she had to do to feed ungrateful mouths. She didn't notice my nerves. She didn't notice much at all, unless it involved someone disobeying her. As for me, I moved like a ghost through the house, haunted by what I had done. The food I had stolen was gone, eaten by a man who could have torn me apart. The file I had taken, a blacksmith's file from Joe's forge, was likely now soaring through chains in the cold marshes. I had betrayed Joe's trust, and Joe was the only person in the world who had ever treated me gently. He, of course, had no idea. Joe simply smiled at me across the room, his big, honest face warm with Christmas cheer, completely unaware that I had used his tools to aid a fugitive. By noon, the kitchen was full of smells: roasted pork, sage and onion, fresh bread, boiled potatoes, and plum pudding steaming on the hearth. Mrs. Joe, wearing her best apron and a glare sharper than her carving knife, had set the table with her usual scowl. Christmas, to her, was less about celebration and more about control. Soon, the guests arrived. Uncle Pumblechook, Joe's pompous, self-important uncle, came first. He always smelled faintly of pepper and pretended to know everything about everything. He patted my head and asked me complicated arithmetic questions before I could sit down. Then there were Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, who spoke in loud voices about how children these days were all destined for prison. Mr. Wopsle, the church clerk, came last, tall, thin, and theatrical, with a voice he used like a trumpet. I sat at the table, small and quiet, my stomach in knots. All through the meal, they spoke of crime and punishment. They told stories about boys who stole apples and ended up hanged, about orphans who ran away and were caught, about how society must be protected from the likes of them. Every sentence felt aimed at me. I wanted to crawl under the table. Then Mrs. Joe turned to the cupboard and declared, "Now we shall have the brandy." Brandy. My heart stopped. That was the very bottle I had opened the night before and refilled with water to cover my tracks. I watched as Mrs. Joe poured a glass and handed it to Uncle Pumblechook, who tossed it back with great ceremony. His face froze. He coughed, choked, spat the brandy across the room. "It's water," he gasped. Mrs. Joe turned purple with rage. "Water? In my brandy?" But before the storm could land on my head, a sudden knock thundered on the door. Everyone froze. Joe rose slowly and opened it. 2 soldiers stood there, uniforms dusted with frost, muskets slung over their shoulders. One of them nodded politely and said, "Beg pardon, sir. We're looking to have a pair of handcuffs repaired. Blacksmith work. Urgent." The room exhaled. It wasn't about me, but I went cold all over again. Handcuffs. Marsh. Convicts. Joe, cheerful as ever, said he'd be glad to help, and the soldiers stepped inside. While Joe examined the broken shackles, they spoke of a search. 2 convicts had escaped. They believed they were hiding in the marshes. They needed a few locals to assist with the manhunt. Joe, ever eager to be helpful, agreed without hesitation. And then to my horror, he said I should come along. "Pip's a good lad," he beamed. Sharp eyes, light feet. The soldiers smiled. I didn't. I was going back to the marshes. This time, not as a secret helper, but as part of the hunt. I could hardly breathe. The file, the food, the man in chains. What would happen if we found him? What would he do when he saw me again? And what would Joe think when he learned what I'd done? The soldiers had their handcuffs repaired, their muskets checked, and their boots tightened for the hunt. I stood among them, my breath visible in the cold morning air, my thoughts racing faster than my feet ever could. Joe walked beside me, unaware of the storm inside my chest. He was excited not because he liked chasing criminals, but because he felt useful, needed, respected. We set out across the marshes, the land still wrapped in a thick morning fog. The soldiers spread out, their voices sharp and purposeful. I trudged between them, stomach churning, watching every shadow, every gust of wind, afraid it might carry the figure I had fed the man I had helped. What if we found him? What if he pointed at me and said, "That's the boy. That's the one who brought me food and a file"? What then? Joe noticed my silence. "Cold, Pip?" he asked kindly. I nodded. "It." He smiled and clapped a big hand on my shoulder. "Stay close, old chap. These marshes aren't friendly." I wanted to cry. Not long after, a shout rang out through the fog. One of the soldiers had spotted footprints, fresh ones leading toward the river. The hunt quickened. The men fanned out, running across the wet ground, following the trail like hounds on a scent. Then we heard it, voices shouting, angry, loud. And then the sound of a struggle. We rushed toward the noise. I stumbled over reeds and stones, breath catching in my throat. There, in a dip in the marsh, two figures were locked in combat, rolling in the mud, fists flying, grunting like animals. One was the man I had helped, the other the second convict, the one he had spoken of with hatred. They were filthy, bleeding, snarling, and yet still managed to throw punches with fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than escape from a shared history. Perhaps a betrayal. The soldiers yelled for them to stop. Muskets were raised. The men separated, gasping, covered in blood and grime. I knew my convict looked straight at me. My heart stopped. He looked away. He said nothing. As the soldiers clapped the handcuffs onto their wrists, the two convicts remained silent. The second man muttered curses under his breath, but mine looked strangely calm, almost proud. "Found you just in time," one soldier said. "You were making quite the racket. He'd have killed me if you hadn't." The second convict snarled. "I meant to," my convict said quietly. "I meant to, but I didn't." They began walking them back toward the village. We followed behind, the soldiers chatting idly, Joe puffing through his mustache, and me utterly silent. As we neared the river, the officers asked how they had survived out here so long. "Stole some food, didn't you?" one said. "Had help, perhaps?" I froze, but my convict only smirked. "Help?" he said. "Me? I took it. Off a ship. Scavenged. No one helped me." He looked at me again, briefly, and I knew what he had done. He was protecting me. Even as he was being marched back to prison, back to punishment, he still kept the secret of a little boy who had knelt in the dark, terrified, and handed him a piece of bread and a rough blacksmith's file. I looked at Joe, still unaware, still good, still kind. I didn't deserve him, and I didn't deserve the man in chains either. Not his silence, not his strange, final kindness, but I received it, and I would never forget. We walked home from the marshes in a kind of weary silence. The wind had died down, and the fog was beginning to lift. But inside me, the storm had not passed. Every step felt like walking through water, slow, heavy, unsure. Joe, cheerful and breathless, chatted with the soldiers. I didn't hear a word of it. My thoughts were with the man we left behind in chains. No one spoke to me. No one suspected anything. I was just a boy who'd gone along on an adventure, silent as always, eyes wide, boots muddy. But I felt older now, not taller, not stronger, just older. Like something inside me had changed. When we reached the house, Mrs. Joe was waiting at the door, arms crossed, her eyes sharp as pins. "So," she said, "you've finally come back. Took long enough." The soldiers thanked us and left, the sound of their boots fading into the distance. Joe wiped his brow with his sleeve and smiled. "Quite the morning, eh, Pip?" I tried to smile back. I couldn't. Inside, the table still held the half-eaten remains of the Christmas feast. cold pork, crumbs of pudding, a dish of potatoes, untouched. The fire had gone low, and the room smelled of smoke and gravy. Mrs. Joe demanded every detail. The soldiers, the convicts, the fight. Joe told the story with wide gestures, full of admiration for the men in uniform. I sat quiet, watching the flames curl in the hearth. He was a rough-looking sort, Joe said. But I'll say this, he stood up for himself. Fierce, like a dog cornered. He was disgusting, Mrs. Joe snapped. Filthy, dangerous. Probably killed someone before he escaped. I didn't say a word. What could I say? That he hadn't killed anyone? That he'd spared his enemy? That he'd lied to protect a boy who brought him food? That I was the boy? No. My secret stayed locked behind my teeth. Later, Joe and I went out to the forge. The anvil was cold, and the coals were dead. But Joe pretended to hammer something anyway. He liked being out there where the noise of iron and fire could drown out anything uncomfortable. Strange day, Pip, he said finally. But I'm glad you came along. Brave of you. I wanted to cry. But I didn't. I just nodded. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the convict's face, how he had looked at me, how he had said nothing, and I wondered if I would ever see him again. I hoped not, but I knew, deep down, that some things don't end just because they disappear into the fog. Some things return, and some kindnesses, even the strange ones, leave marks that never fade. My education began at the village school, a room behind the church, damp and full of cold drafts, where we wrote letters with ink so thin it looked like tears. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt ran it, though ran is a generous word. She mostly slept in a chair while we recited the alphabet to the walls. Her idea of instruction was yelling the word discipline whenever she stirred. It was, as Joe might say, a poor place for minds to grow. I wasn't particularly bright, or at least, I didn't think so. The letters danced on the page, and the lines blurred. But I tried, mostly because I knew Joe couldn't read or write. And I wanted to be just a little better for both of us. Joe would sit beside me at night, watching with admiration as I scratched my name onto a slate. "What a scholar you'll be, Pip," he'd say, as though I were carving poetry. One evening, after supper, I brought out my schoolbook and asked Joe to try spelling his name. It didn't go well. He held the chalk like it might bite him, and after a few crooked lines, the page looked more like a chicken's footprints than any word I knew. "Seems like a J," Joe said, "but it might also be a hammer." I laughed, gently, but he laughed with me. Joe never minded being laughed at, not when it came from love. "I didn't go to school," he explained, his voice soft. "Mother tried to teach me, but father was, well, he wasn't gentle. She couldn't teach with bruises on her arms. So I grew up learning the forge, not the alphabet. I was quiet after that. There were some things words couldn't fix." The next morning, Uncle Pumblechook came to visit. He was puffed up with self-importance, as always, and reeked of pepper and pride. "Boy," he barked, barely inside the door, "you are summoned." "Summoned?" I blinked. "Yes, by Miss Havisham herself. A great lady, a rich lady, and she's asked to see you." I looked to Joe, who looked to Mrs. Joe, who looked triumphant. "I told you this boy would make something of himself," she cried. "Didn't I say I'd raise him proper?" Joe said nothing, but his eyes said everything. Worry, pride, confusion all mixed together like the soot in his apron. "Who is Miss Havisham?" I asked. Uncle Pumblechook straightened his coat. "A lady of high station, lives in Saty's house, doesn't go out, never married, very particular, and she wants a boy to entertain her, to play perhaps, or recite poetry, or fetch things. It's an honor. It didn't feel like one. That night, I hardly slept. I kept thinking about this mysterious woman in a big house who never left, who sent for strangers, who was particular. I imagined her draped in lace and shadow, whispering secrets through dusty curtains. What would she want with me? Why me? By morning, my clothes were scrubbed, my boots polished, and my ears cleaned with such vigor I thought I'd go deaf. Mrs. Joe fussed over every button, like she was sending me to be crowned king. You behave, she warned. Mind your tongue. Don't slouch. Joe walked me down to Uncle Pumblechook's shop. He didn't say much, just patted my back and gave me a smile so gentle it nearly undid me. And then I was off towards Saty's house, towards something new, something strange, something that would change everything. The journey to Saty's house was short, but to me, it felt like miles. I rode with Uncle Pumblechook in his cart, bumping over muddy roads, my stomach full of nerves and questions. Uncle Pumblechook, proud as a rooster, asked me arithmetic problems the entire way. If a baker gives you 4 loaves at $1 each, and I nodded along, pretending to care, while my thoughts drifted to the mysterious lady I was about to meet. Saty's house sat behind high brick walls topped with broken glass. The iron gate groaned as it opened, revealing a courtyard full of weeds and silence. No children played here. No dogs barked. Even the birds seemed to avoid it. The house was old, not charmingly old, but crumbling, as if time had leaned on it too long. Curtains hung limp in dusty windows. No light flickered behind them. Uncle Pumblechook knocked on the front door. A girl answered. She was about my age, but she held herself like a queen, pale, sharp-featured, with dark, shining eyes, and an expression that made it clear you were beneath her notice. You're the boy, she said flatly. Come in. She didn't ask my name. She didn't smile. She turned on her heel and left me to follow, which I did, feeling smaller with each step. We walked through silent halls where every clock had stopped. The wallpaper peeled like old skin. Dust lay thick as snow. She led me into a room that smelled of wax and age and something sweet, like wilted flowers. There, seated at a dressing table, was Miss Havisham. She wore a bridal gown, or what had once been a bridal gown. Now it was yellowed, fraying at the seams, and clung to her like cobwebs. One shoe was missing. Her veil hung like smoke around her face. She didn't turn when we entered. She simply stared at herself in the mirror. Who's this? She asked softly. Pip, Mum, I said, barely above a whisper. Come closer, Pip. Let me look at you. I stepped forward. Heart hammering. She reached out with a hand like dry parchment and touched my chin, turning my face left, then right. Young, she murmured. Common. Yes, he'll do. She dropped her hand and looked toward the girl. Play, Estella, play with him. I turned, unsure what play meant in this house. Estella led me to another room with a faded rug and a deck of cards. We sat across from each other in silence. Her eyes stayed on my face, cool and unreadable. You call those boots? I looked down. They were scuffed, though freshly polished. Your hands are coarse, she added. And you call yourself a gentleman? I didn't reply. Go on, she said. Play, play. So we played. She beat me easily. She smirked each time. And I, Pip, the boy from the forge, felt something I had never felt before, ashamed of who I was. When it was over, Estella left the room. I waited, unsure what to do. Miss Havisham called me back in. "Well?" "She says I'm coarse and common, ma'am," I admitted. "And do you think she's pretty?" I blushed. "Yes, ma'am, very. You shall come again." She waved a hand, and I was dismissed. Estella walked me to the gate. She didn't speak, just opened it and watched me go. As I stepped outside, I heard the gate creak shut behind me. I looked back, but she was already gone. I walked all the way home, and I cried. Not loud, not with sobs, but slow, quiet tears that came from some new place inside me. A place that now knew what it felt like to be looked down upon and to care. By the time I walked home from Satis house, my feet were blistered, my mind spinning, and my heart heavier than it had ever been. The house, the stopped clocks, the faded wedding dress, Miss Havisham's decaying world clung to me like cobwebs. But it wasn't the dust or the silence that haunted me most. It was Estella. Her words echoed in my mind. Coarse hands, thick boots, common boy. And the worst part? She was right. I didn't belong in that house. I didn't belong in her world. I was just a blacksmith's boy, rough, poor, and invisible. And yet, for reasons I couldn't understand, I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to approve. I wanted more. When I got home, Mrs. Joe attacked me with questions the moment I stepped through the door. Well, did she feed you? Did she look rich? Did she smell of perfume? What did you do? What did she say? Joe watched quietly, as always, gentle eyes resting on me. I didn't want to tell them the truth. I didn't want to say how embarrassed I'd been, how the girl had made me feel like dirt, how everything at Satis house was strange and sad and cold, how I'd left feeling smaller than when I arrived. So instead, I lied. I told them Miss Havisham had a black carriage and servants in gold buttons. I said we dined off silver plates. I invented a tall tale about playing with a sword, and Estella serving me cake on a jeweled tray. I even claimed there were dogs dressed in velvet and a huge feast with music. Mrs. Joe drank it all in like wine. "I knew it," she cried. "Didn't I say he was meant for better things?" Uncle Pumblechook, who had done nothing but deliver me to the gate, took credit for the whole affair. If not for me, that boy would still be rolling in mud. Joe didn't speak much, but later that evening, as we sat together by the forge, he looked at me and said softly, "Pip, that were a good story. Too good, maybe." I looked at him, startled. He wasn't angry, just knowing. "You see, old chap," he continued, "lies is lies, whether they're big or small. And when you start bending the truth, it don't bend back." His words burned worse than any scolding. Joe wasn't clever. He couldn't read or write. But he was honest, solid, like the iron he worked. And I had lied to his face. I wanted to confess, to say, "Joe, I made it all up because I felt like nothing." But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the flames, ashamed. That night, in bed, I didn't dream of velvet dogs or golden plates. I dreamed of Estella and her eyes, and how she had made me feel so small. I had to build a castle of lies just to feel tall again. The lie I told about Miss Havisham's house didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made the truth heavier. I kept replaying Estella's voice in my mind, the cool way she said "coarse hands," the flicker of a smirk when I couldn't play cards properly. Her words didn't just embarrass me. They changed something inside me. They made me want to escape the life I had. I no longer felt proud of the forge, or of being Joe's apprentice one day, or of my simple meals and muddy boots. I wanted to be different, polished, important, educated. I wanted to be a gentleman, and with that want came shame. For Joe, for my home, for everything I once thought was enough. That morning, I walked into town alone. I didn't tell Joe where I was going. I just needed to be away. I wandered into a public house, a quiet tavern where travelers passed through and villagers swapped gossip. I was too young to be there, really, but no one seemed to notice me or care. I sat in the corner, watching, listening. That's when I saw him. A man older, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, sipping rum at the bar. He had the look of someone who'd been places, done things. There was something rough in his clothes, but sharp in his eyes. He turned and looked right at me. "Young master," he said. "You from around here?" "Yes, sir," he nodded. "Thought so. You look like you've got honest feet. Strong legs. Blacksmith's boy, maybe." I stiffened. "I live with a blacksmith," I admitted. He smiled. "I used to know one. Long ago." There was a pause. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out something. A file, not a new one. An old one, worn down from use. My stomach turned cold. That file looked exactly like the one I'd stolen for the convict. Before I could speak, he leaned in closer. "Just a little token," he said. "From a friend. He said you'd know what it meant." And then he stood up, finished his drink, and walked out, leaving me frozen to the bench. I sat there a long while. So, the convict hadn't forgotten. He had sent someone to watch me. Or maybe this man had followed me on his own. Maybe they were part of something bigger. Maybe I was part of something now, too. When I got back home, Joe greeted me with a smile, soot on his hands, and a hammer in his grip. The fire in the forge blazed behind him. "How was your walk, Pip?" he asked. I couldn't answer. Not truthfully, because I wasn't sure what it had been. A walk? Or the beginning of something much stranger? That night, I didn't dream of Estella. I dreamed of shadows, of eyes watching me from corners, of men with chains and men with files. And somewhere, in all that darkness, I dreamed of myself, in fine clothes, standing tall, no soot on my face, no fear in my voice. A gentleman, but that dream was still far away. For now, I was still Pip the boy with muddy boots, a stolen secret, and a name that suddenly didn't feel big enough for who I wanted to be. A week after my first visit, I was summoned to Satyrs' house again. Uncle Pumblechook was even more insufferable this time, fussing over my clothes, straightening my collar, and warning me to mind my manners around ladies. I nodded through it all, but my thoughts were already inside that dusty house, in rooms with stopped clocks and pale curtains that never stirred. When I arrived, the same gate, the same girl. Estella. She didn't say hello, didn't smile, just looked me over, like I was a coat someone else had worn before. "You're late," she said. I wasn't, but I didn't argue. She led me through the same dim hallways, and again, the smell of age and wax clung to the walls. But this time, Miss Havisham wasn't alone. There were guests, men and women, all dressed stiffly, all with the same frozen smiles. They greeted Miss Havisham with flourished bows and syrupy voices, calling her "dear lady" and our honoured hostess, though she barely looked at them. One man stood out younger than the rest, with dark hair, a sneering mouth, and eyes that never stopped moving. His name, I later learned, was Bentley Drummle. I didn't like him. Estella didn't seem to like him either, or anyone, for that matter. But when she passed among them, they watched her like she was a jewel locked in a glass case. Beautiful, untouchable. Miss Havisham called me to her side. "So, boy," she said, resting her hand on mine, "has she broken your heart yet?" I blinked. Ma'am, she will. That's what she's for. She turned her gaze to Estella. You see, Pip, I raised her to be loved and never to love. She will be your lesson. Estella, standing a few feet away, didn't flinch. Later, Miss Havisham sent us off to play cards again. In the same room, at the same table, as if time hadn't passed since my last visit. Estella dealt the cards without looking at me. You're staring, she said. I wasn't. You always do. I don't mean to. Then don't. We played in silence. After the game, Estella led me to the yard. The guests were leaving. One of the older men nodded at me, muttering something about Miss Havisham's project. Bentley Drummle bumped into me on purpose as he passed. Careful, boy, he said. I felt my fists clench, but Estella placed a hand on my arm, barely a touch, and whispered, Don't. He's not worth it. It was the first kindness she'd shown me, but it only confused me more. As I left Satis house, I glanced back. Estella stood in the doorway, framed by shadow, her face unreadable. I didn't know what I was part of. A game? A test? A performance? All I knew was that I wanted to return, even if it meant being hurt, even if it meant being nothing more than a boy with coarse hands and a heart too eager to offer. From that day forward, I became a regular visitor at Satis house. Every few days, I would walk the now familiar path through the marshes and knock on that iron gate. Estella would answer, silent as ever, sometimes nodding, sometimes ignoring me entirely, but she always let me in. Miss Havisham never left her room. She sat in her faded wedding gown, surrounded by stopped clocks and rotting lace, staring into a mirror or at Estella with eyes that burned like coals. Each time I entered, she would ask the same question, Do you love her yet? And I would lie, or at least try. I don't know, ma'am. You will, she said. You must. That's what you're here for. Sometimes we played cards. Sometimes I read aloud. Most times, Estella and I simply sat in the same room, breathing the same dust, not speaking. And yet, I watched her every move, the way her fingers folded over the edges of her sleeves, the way her eyes narrowed when she was bored, the way her footsteps never made a sound. I was spellbound, but I also felt a growing ache. The more time I spent at Satis house, the more I noticed the difference between their world and mine. The cracked teacups were still finer than anything in our kitchen. The mouldy curtains still belonged to rooms 10 times grander than our cottage. And Estella, cold, proud, elegant Estella, made me feel like I was made of clay, not blood. I began to dread returning home after each visit. I no longer saw the forge as a place of strength. It felt dirty, loud, full of smoke and sweat and things I had grown ashamed of. Joe noticed. He never said so, but I could feel it in the way he watched me carefully, like he was trying to understand something he couldn't name, and I didn't know how to explain it. Miss Havisham never spoke of my future. She never said what she wanted from me, or how long I was meant to visit. I didn't even know if she paid for my time, if money had changed hands between her and my sister. No one told me anything, so I waited, and I hoped, and each time I left the house, I looked back just once to see if Estella was watching me go. She never was. One day, as I was preparing to leave again, Joe pulled me aside. Pip, he said gently, I reckon you've grown quiet lately. I looked down at my boots. They were scuffed again. Things feel different, I said. They often do, Joe replied. But don't forget where you came from, or who you are. I nodded. But inside, I wasn't so sure anymore. Who was I? A boy from the forge? Or someone waiting for something greater? And if Miss Havisham wasn't the one to change my life, who would be? One morning, without warning, Miss Havisham told me I would not be returning to Satis House. She said it so simply, as if commenting on the weather. "It is done, Pip. You've played enough. You may go now." That was it. No explanation. No farewell from Estella. No reward. No promise. Not even a thank you. Just done. My heart dropped into my boots. I had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that Miss Havisham had a plan for me, that one day she would send for me, call me her ward, raise me into a gentleman, and maybe even let me marry Estella. But in one breath, she swept all that away. I walked home in silence. When I told Jo and my sister, she was furious not at Miss Havisham, but at me for somehow ruining the opportunity. "You were probably rude," she hissed, "or lazy, or you said something improper." I didn't defend myself. I didn't have the energy. But Jo said something I would never forget. Maybe Miss Havisham wanted just what she got. A boy to walk in, look around, and walk back out. That doesn't mean Pip did wrong. That's just how some folks are. It was quiet after that, until Uncle Pumblechook appeared, wearing his usual smug grin and a smell of strong pepper. Ahem. It seems the boy is now to be apprenticed. My sister lit up again, her pride reignited. "You hear that, Pip? A blacksmith's apprentice." "It's settled." Jo looked at me gently, but didn't say much. He seemed happy in his quiet way. The paperwork was arranged the next day. We walked into town, Uncle Pumblechook leading the way, as if he were the one being bound into service. The lawyer, Mr. Jaggers, handled the contract. He was a tall, stern man, with deep-set eyes and a voice like a hammer. "This document binds the boy to Joseph Gargery for a term of years. Apprenticeship in blacksmithing. Wages, none. Education, none. Food and lodging, as agreed." He read the terms without blinking. I signed. So did Jo. There it was. My future forged in ink and sealed with a stamp. We left the office in silence. Uncle Pumblechook clapped my shoulder so hard I staggered. "Congratulations, boy. A real trade. None of that foolish dreaming anymore." I wanted to be happy. I wanted to smile for Jo, but all I could think about was Estella's voice in my head. Coarse hands, common boy. That night, Jo and I sat outside the forge. He smoked his pipe. I stared into the dark. "I'll teach you everything I know, Pip," he said quietly, "and we'll make something fine of you yet." I nodded, but I already knew I didn't want to be a blacksmith. Not really, not anymore. Becoming Jo's apprentice should have been a proud moment. It should have meant the start of an honest trade, a secure life, a future shaped by iron and fire. Jo was kind, patient, and willing to teach me everything he knew. He had waited for this day, the day he could finally call me his partner, with quiet excitement. And yet, I was not proud. I was ashamed. Not of Jo, never of Jo, but of what I believed this life represented. The forge, once warm and welcoming, now felt loud and suffocating. The clang of hammer on metal rang in my ears like judgment. My apron itched. My hands blistered. My boots were heavy. But it was more than the work. It was me. I had changed. Or rather, Satis House had changed me. Estella had changed me. Each morning, I would wake early, scrub my hands raw, and look in the mirror hoping, somehow, to see something more refined, more worthy. But no matter how hard I tried, I was still Pip, a blacksmith's boy with calloused fingers and dreams too big for his village. Jo noticed, of course. He never said anything, but I saw it in his eyes the way they searched my face for the old Pip, the one who used to laugh at sparks and marvel at molten metal. That Pip was gone, and I couldn't bring him back. Sometimes, at night, I would sit outside the forge and stare at the sky. I imagined the stars were candles in the halls of great houses, or jewels on Estella's wrist. I imagined her laughing not at me, but beside me. Other times, I would read. Books became my escape. I read whatever I could get my hands on. Poetry, plays, letters, anything that spoke of a life beyond the soot. One evening, Joe found me reading by the dying light. "You always had a quick mind," he said, with quiet admiration. "I don't want to be just a blacksmith." I blurted out, then instantly regretted it. Joe looked at me. Not hurt, just still. "You don't have to want what I want, Pip," he said. "But don't be ashamed of where you come from." I didn't know how to respond. How do you tell the person who's given you everything that it's not enough? How do you explain the ache of wanting more without sounding ungrateful? So I said nothing, and he said nothing more either. From that night on, a quiet distance settled between us. Not angry, not bitter, just distant. Like two men working side by side at the anvil, but dreaming in different directions. I had been an apprentice for 4 years. My arms had grown strong from swinging the hammer. My back had learned to bend with the work. My hands were rougher than ever, but my heart, it was softer. Or perhaps just sadder. No matter how much I worked, no matter how much Joe praised me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant for more. That the forge, for all its heat and strength, was not where I belonged. So I asked Joe for something foolish. "I'd like to take half a day off," I said one morning, wiping sweat from my brow. "What for, Pip?" "To visit Miss Havisham." Joe paused, the hammer in his hand stilled. "Thought she were done with you." "Maybe she is," I said, "but I want to say thank you, properly." Joe nodded. He always trusted me, even when he shouldn't have. So I cleaned myself up, put on my best clothes, though they still didn't fit quite right, and walked to Satis house, hoping to see Estella. But she wasn't there, only Miss Havisham. She sat in her usual place, draped in yellowed lace, still surrounded by still clocks. "Why have you come, boy?" "To thank you, ma'am, for the kindness you showed me." "Kindness?" She laughed. "That's not what I gave you." I didn't know what to say. "You can go now," she said. "Tell no one you've been here. Tell..." I left feeling more empty than when I arrived. When I returned home, I found Orlick waiting at the forge. Orlick was one of Joe's workers, tall, sullen, with narrow eyes that never smiled. I had never liked him, and I was certain he didn't like me either. That day, he was in a foul mood, snarling about work, about my easy life, about Joe giving me too much favor. He said it loud enough for Mrs. Joe to hear, and that was a mistake. She stormed out of the house, apron flying, and shouted him down. "Don't you speak like that in my home." "Then maybe you should stay in your house, woman." Joe stepped between them. "That's enough, Orlick." The room went quiet. Then, without warning, Orlick swung. Fist met flesh. A grunt. A crash. Joe didn't strike back immediately. He hated violence. But Orlick hit again, and this time, Joe reacted. The fight was quick but fierce. Sparks flew from the forge as fists flew through the air. Tools fell. A stool broke, and in the end, Joe stood firm. Orlick slunk away, bruised and breathing hard. I had never seen Joe fight before. I had always thought him gentle, mild, but now I saw that gentleness could be strong. That kindness could have muscle. That love could defend itself. Mrs. Joe said little afterward, but I could see she looked at Joe with new eyes, not kinder eyes, but more careful ones. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of 3 people: Estella, far away. Miss Havisham, rotting in her wedding gown, and Joe, kind, powerful Joe, who had fought for me without question. I didn't know who I wanted to be, but I knew who I didn't want to lose. I was woken in the middle of the night by a scream. It was shrill, sharp, the kind of sound that tears through dreams and leaves only dread behind. I stumbled out of bed, heart thudding, feet cold on the floor. Joe was already halfway down the stairs. We ran toward the sound. It came from the kitchen, and there we found her, Mrs. Joe. She was lying on the floor, motionless. A broken candle rolled near her hand, its flame flickering wildly. The back door stood open, swinging in the wind. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no shattered plates, but she was hurt, badly. Joe knelt beside her. "Dear God," he whispered. "What's happened?" She didn't respond. Her head bled from a wound, a brutal one. Her face was slack, her breathing shallow. She looked nothing like the fiery woman we knew. She looked small. We sent for help. Mr. Wopsle, the Hubbles, even Pumblechook came. Everyone had an opinion. Of course, burglars, revenge, a wild man, a ghost. But no one knew for sure. The only clue? A rusty leg iron. It had been left by the fireplace. An old one, broken, clean through, like the one I had helped a convict saw off years ago. I said nothing, but the sight of that iron turned my blood cold. Mrs. Joe survived, but she was never the same. She couldn't speak clearly. She couldn't walk without help. Her eyes looked at us, but not through the same fire. The woman who had once ruled the house with thunder and wooden spoons now needed help to sit upright. Joe took care of her with such tenderness that it broke my heart. He brushed her hair. He fed her with a spoon. He never raised his voice, never complained. I helped too, when I could, but mostly I watched a man who had once been in the background now step forward with quiet strength, and watched a woman who had once loomed so large in my life shrink into silence. People in the village said it must have been Orlick, that he'd come back for revenge, but there was no proof. And he denied it. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that something dark had entered our home, and nothing would ever be quite the same. I began to understand something then, in the flicker of the hearthlight and the long silences that followed. Life wasn't just about dreams and ambitions. It was also about loss and what you do with what's left behind. Life settled into a new rhythm after the attack on Mrs. Joe. Quieter, slower, heavier. She could no longer speak properly, but she seemed to try. Her hands would move in the air, sometimes forming half words or shapes we had to guess at. At times, she grew agitated and beat the table with her fists. Other times, she just stared at the wall, as though it held memories no one else could see. Joe remained patient, tireless, gentle, and then there was Biddy. She came to live with us at first, just to help, but slowly, she became part of the home. Biddy was plain, thoughtful, soft-spoken. She never tried to be more than she was, and that was exactly what made her valuable. She understood things no one else could, including Mrs. Joe's strange new language. Somehow, Biddy knew when she wanted her shawl, or when her head hurt, or when a silent tear on her cheek meant everything. I began to walk with Biddy sometimes in the evenings, down the country lanes. After the day's work was done, we talked, not always about anything important, just life, the forge, books, small things. But one evening, as the sky turned orange and the wind tugged at the hedges, I said something I hadn't told anyone. "Biddy, I wish I were a gentleman." She looked at me, calm and clear. "Why?" "So Estella wouldn't look down on me." She didn't answer right away. You think being a gentleman would make her love you? No. But at least I wouldn't be ashamed in front of her. Biddy walked a few steps in silence. Pip, she said gently, I hope you never stop wanting to improve yourself. But don't let shame push you into becoming someone you're not. I didn't like that answer. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. And I didn't want to be told that Estella might never love me, no matter what shoes I wore. Do you like her? I asked suddenly. Estella? Yes. I don't know her, but I think she doesn't make you happy. That stung, but I said nothing because a part of me knew she was right. As the days passed, I found myself depending on Biddy's presence more and more. She was steady in a world that no longer felt steady. She was kind, without asking for thanks. She never tried to impress anyone, and she saw through me gently, but completely. Still, I didn't love her, not the way I loved Estella, and that, too, made me feel ashamed. Why couldn't I want someone who wanted me back? Why couldn't I love what was good for me? But love, I was learning, doesn't always listen to reason. It listens to memory, to longing, to pain. And mine still belonged to a cold, elegant girl behind the iron gates of a house where all the clocks had stopped. It was the 4th year of my apprenticeship with Joe, and a Saturday evening found us perched by the fire in the Three Jolly Bargemen's tap room. Mr. Wopsle was holding court again, narrating a gruesome murder from the newspaper with overblown theatrics. My blood is on fire with agony, he bellowed as the victim. I'll have my revenge, he roared as the murderer. We sat, wide-eyed, enthralled by his howl, until a stranger at the edge of the group interrupted his face, calm, mocking, eyes cold. Convenient verdict, gentlemen, he said softly, almost clipped. Guilty, naturally. Have you considered the law declares a man innocent until proven guilty? Laughter died on Mr. Wopsle's lips. The room fell uneasy. Curious, I elbowed Joe, and he nodded. We both recognized him, the man I'd met once at Miss Havisham's, all soap scent and disdain. After the awkward silence, the stranger requested a private word with us. Joe hesitated, guilt in his eyes, a quiet man unsure of strangers. But I nodded. He was always curious for me. At our home, he introduced himself formally. Jaggers, he said, a lawyer from London. He stood straight-backed, practiced, and dry. He said he was there on behalf of someone who wished to fund Pip's transformation into a gentleman. Joe stiffened. I felt my heart begin to climb. A generous benefactor, Mr. Jaggers continued, has provided a considerable inheritance for Pip. You may leave the forge, learn at your leisure, and go to London at once. My disbelief lodged in my chest. Was this real? There were conditions. I must keep the name Pip. I must not inquire about the benefactor's identity. Communication must be through Mr. Jaggers alone until the benefactor wished to reveal himself. Joe's face softened with pride and sorrow. He wanted to demand compensation, to assert himself, but he swallowed it, quietly grateful. As that man left, I stood trembling. The world I had longed for to be refined, recognized, stood before me, handed in pristine gloves. I believed, of course, that Miss Havisham was behind this all. She had always held the power to reshape my future, or so I thought. That night, Joe and I sat in silence. The forge noise echoed empty without purpose. He tried to speak, but every word felt weighed down by love, loss, and pride he held for me. I stared at the fire, trying to imagine London, universities, elegant clothes, and wondering, confusingly, if I still belonged by his side. The day of my departure arrived, and the sky above the village was the color of old pewter. I stood outside the forge one last time, hands in my coat pockets, trying to feel proud, but mostly, I felt hollow. The place that had once been my whole world now looked smaller than ever. Joe was already at the anvil, pretending to work. His hammer moved, but without force. Every now and then, he wiped his brow with his sleeve, though the air was cold and the fire low. Inside the house, Biddy helped pack my few belongings. She folded each shirt with care, smoothing the creases with her palms. I watched her fingers, thinking how different they were from Estella's no rings, no polish, just strong and kind. "Will you write to us, Pip?" she asked quietly. "Of course I will, and not forget where you came from." I hesitated. Never. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. When the time came, we walked together down the lane, Joe, Biddy, and I. The village looked as it always had, but now I noticed the cracks, the lean of old buildings, the way the streets dipped into mud. It was strange how everything looked smaller when you were about to leave. At the coach station, I turned to Joe. He had something in his hand, a little pouch of coins. His savings. "You'll need it, Pip," he said. "City living ain't cheap." I shook my head. "Mr. Jaggers said he'll provide." "Still," Joe interrupted. "It's from me to you. Take it." His eyes were wet, though he pretended they weren't. Then he did something unexpected. He took off his hat and held out his hand, not for me to shake, but as if I were already a gentleman, and I took it. "Goodbye, dear Joe. Goodbye, Pip, my boy." I turned to Biddy. She gave me a small smile, not forced, not sad, just wise. "London is big," she said. "Don't lose yourself in it." Then the coach came. I climbed aboard, heart pounding. I sat by the window, staring out at the two of them. Joe with his simple strength, Biddy with her quiet grace fading into the distance. The wheels turned, the village fell behind, and ahead of me lay London, a place I had dreamed of, longed for, imagined in glittering gold. But as the miles stretched on, I felt something unexpected. Not joy, not pride, but a kind of grief. I was leaving behind more than smoke and soot. I was leaving behind the version of myself that had loved simply, dreamed honestly, and belonged somewhere. And though I didn't know it yet, that version of me might be the hardest thing to get back. The stagecoach rattled into London in the early afternoon, as if dragging my hopes along with its wheels. The roads narrowed, the buildings leaned over me, and a dense grey sky settled like a lid over the city. I had left Kent with a pulse full of eager dreams, only to find London as dirty and crooked as I had feared. My destination was Mr. Jaggers's office, in a nameless street near Smithfield Market. The coachman, wrapped in layers of greasy capes, dropped me grudgingly with a nod at the door painted simply, "M.R. Jaggers." Even he seemed wary of the name. I entered, clutching my little bag, and asked the clerk if the lawyer was home. "He's in court," came the curt answer. "He'll see you soon." The clerk had no time for pleasantries. He ushered me into a room lit by a single skylight. It felt more tomb than office cold, oppressive. Skewed windows mutely peered down, and scattered on a wooden shelf were strange items. A rusty pistol, a sheathed sword, and two eerie casts of swollen faces. The air was heavy with expectation and secret guilt. I couldn't stay. I slipped back out into London's throbbing streets, letting the noise wash over me. I found myself drawn towards Smithfield, and there, looming like a jagged memory of fear, stood Newgate Prison. Its walls held echoes of punishment and despair. A drunken man nearby beckoned to me, offering a front-row view of a trial or perhaps an execution. I turned away, stomach tight with dread. I retraced my steps to Jaggers's office, where more anxious and defeated faces waited outside. Wordless pleas were written on their strained expressions. When the lawyer finally emerged, he swept past them, his face stone, utterly disinterested in their stories, concerned only with payment. Then it was my turn. Jaggers nodded once, painfully brief, and motioned me to follow him. In his office, with the same solemnity he used with criminals, he outlined the arrangements. I would stay at Barnard's Inn with the son of Mr. Matthew Pocket until Monday. On Monday, I would go to the Pocket household to begin my education. A generous allowance was arranged for me, and Jaggers handed me contact cards for tradesmen, tailors, shoemakers, hatters. He warned me, without sentiment, that I would inevitably go wrong with money, and that he would keep track to check any runaway expenses. He spoke and moved as though the future were a contract formally binding, unromantic, real. Then Mr. Wemmick Jaggers's clerk stepped forward. His voice was lighter. He escorted me through the crowd outside and into the gloomy street, moving with quiet purpose. As I walked, London throbbed around me. I carried a small packet full of promises and a new name. Barnard's Inn felt empty, austere, yet in its shadows, Pip the blacksmith's apprentice began to fade, and Pip, the gentleman, took tentative shape. I spent my first night in London at Barnard's Inn, a small, smoky lodging tucked behind soot-darkened walls and creaky gates. The room I was shown to was musty, with faded curtains and a fireplace that wheezed more than it breathed. I had imagined something grander, something fitting of a future gentleman. Instead, I got cracked wallpaper and a basin with a crooked mirror. The next morning, I waited nervously for the young man I was meant to live with, the son of Mr. Matthew Pocket, who would soon be my tutor. The door opened, and to my astonishment, standing there, just as surprised to see me, was the pale young gentleman I had once fought at Miss Havisham's. We stared at each other for a moment. Then he laughed. "You're the fellow who gave me that beautiful black eye." I flushed. "And you're the one who challenged me to a boxing match." He grinned. "What a world. Come, shake hands. I'm Herbert Pocket." So this was my roommate. And now, my friend. Herbert was cheerful, light-footed, and endlessly talkative. While I sat quiet and unsure, he bustled about the room, showing me where to put my things, opening windows to chase out the stale air, and promising to civilize me quickly. He told me about the Pockets, his large, scattered family full of scholars, dreamers, and chaos. His father, Matthew, would be my tutor, a man Herbert described as intelligent, but constantly distracted. "My mother thinks we descend from royalty," Herbert said with a shrug, "which is why she refuses to admit we're quite poor." Then, over breakfast, he asked the question I had expected. "Do you know who your benefactor is?" I hesitated. "No," I said, "but I think it's Miss Havisham." Herbert nodded. "Makes sense. She's strange enough to do something generous in a cryptic way." Then, with a strange gentleness, he added, "Don't fall too deep for Estella, Pip. She's been raised to not feel." I didn't reply, not because I disagreed, but because it was already too late. Over the next few days, Herbert and I settled into a rhythm at Barnard's Inn. We made jokes about the leaky roof, learned to ignore the uneven floors, and shared simple meals that always ended in laughter. Herbert had a way of making everything seem lighter, even my worries. One evening, as the wind rattled the windows and the fire gave off more smoke than heat, I finally asked him, "Herbert, you seem to know a lot about Miss Havisham. What's her story?" He paused, then leaned back in his chair, fingers laced behind his head. "Well, since you're practically part of it now, I suppose I can tell you." And so he did. He told me how Miss Havisham had once been a proud, wealthy young woman, the only daughter of a very rich brewer. She had grown up, pampered, adored, perhaps even spoiled, but then she fell in love. With the wrong man, Herbert said. A man who charmed her out of her reason. He was a scoundrel, clever, smooth-tongued, and after her fortune, they were engaged to be married. The invitations were sent, the feast prepared, the cake made, but on the wedding day, he never came. A letter arrived, Herbert continued, saying he was gone. Forever. Just like that. She never recovered. From that moment on, time stopped at Saty's house. The clocks were frozen. The cake was left to rot, and Miss Havisham, once lively, became a ghost in her own home, draped in the gown she had never worn at the altar. She's lived in the past ever since, Herbert said softly, and she's raised Estella to break hearts the way hers was broken. That stunned me. Estella isn't her daughter. Adopted, Herbert confirmed. No one knows where she came from. One day, she was just there. I stared into the fire, trying to connect what I'd heard with the proud, cold girl I remembered. And the man who left Miss Havisham. Herbert's voice darkened. Rumors say he was involved with another, maybe even plotted it all with her. No one knows for sure. The story haunted me. It made me pity Miss Havisham more than ever, but also fear what she might be shaping Estella into. Why would she make Estella so cruel? I asked. Because she wants revenge, Herbert said simply. Not on one man, but on all men. I lay awake that night thinking about it all. About Estella's distant eyes. About Miss Havisham's decaying veil. About how love, real or broken, could twist a person into someone they never meant to be. And still, despite everything I had learned, my heart whispered the same foolish thing. You still love her. I arrived at Mr. Matthew Pocket's house on a temperate evening in London, full of both dread and excitement. The building stood behind an austere entrance plain in appearance, yet inside, its rooms were warm and claustrophobic, full of portraits, books, and the quiet hum of genteel chaos. Mr. Pocket greeted me at the door, cordially but distractedly. "I'm glad to see you, Pip," he said in his kindly, absent way. "I hope you're not sorry to see me, for I certainly am not the frightful figure I've often heard mentioned." His smile, pale and genial, made me smile back despite the nerves in my throat. He led me to my room, a modest, comfortable chamber with a narrow chest, a writing desk, and a small window that caught the evening light. There was something unassuming but soothing in it, as if it existed to hold me gently in place during a time of upheaval. Then he introduced me to two other young men sharing the house. Bentley Drummle, a hulking figure with an ironical sneer and the air of entitled awkwardness, and Startop, slighter and softer, with earnest eyes and careful manners. They received me with polite nods, as though sizing me up for debut, though whom I'd never say. Dinner was another matter entirely. Mrs. Pocket presided over the table, resplendent in airs and ignorance. Halfway through a novel about titled nobility, she paused to ask me if I preferred the scent of orange flower water, an oddly personal question that carried no meaning, save to underline her empty refinement. I didn't know how to answer, so I nodded. She was raised to marry a title, her father so convinced of the nobility of ancient blood that he prevented her from learning anything practical, managing a home, declaring that a woman of her birth should never sully herself with plebeian tasks. So, when she eloped with Mr. Pocket in a most unconventional coup, the idea of marriage to a noble was dream turned reality, though without fortune, and not quite as glorious as she'd imagined. She remained ornamental, helpless, forever carried by her illusions. Mr. Pocket sat at her side, head in hands more than at the table, anxious and distracted. He had once excelled at Cambridge, destined for greatness, perhaps Parliament, perhaps the church. Instead, he became a tutor, eking out a living correcting texts and coaching hopeful students. But in his kindness and gentle intelligence lay real nobility, hidden by his wife's pretense. Meanwhile, the servants ran the house with quiet mastery. The household's real workings pulsed unseen behind the scenes, Mrs. Pocket so focused on her self-image that the kitchen might as well have been another universe. A neighborly visitor, Mrs. Coiler, dropped in to admire Mrs. Pocket's fine airs. She wept over the tragedy that a daughter of a knight, a treasure for a prince, I was told, had not married more suitably. The pity sounded hollow, though Mrs. Pocket accepted it with regal poise. Throughout dinner, Drummle barely spoke. Startop leaned forward, sharing small observations, and I focused on my utensils, lying between the courses, and the tension in the air. I felt both out of place and compelled to belong, as though the dinner table were a stage on which I had unwillingly stumbled. Afterwards, Herbert Pocket, my roommate, took me by the shoulder. "Now you see where I come from," he said softly, guiding me toward the door with a kind grin. "It's a circus, but we'll manage." I looked back at the Pockets' drawing room, hushed and ornate, suffused with social expectations and silent judgments, and I thought, this is where I will learn to stand taller, but at what cost? In the days following my visit to the Pocket household, I began to settle into the strange rhythms of London. The noise, the smoke, the endless footfalls, it all still overwhelmed me. But in between moments of confusion and awe, I began to feel excited. There was a sense of possibility here, of reinvention, and at the center of it all stood Mr. Jaggers. He summoned me back to his office that week. The streets around Little Britain were as bleak as ever. His door, scratched and unwelcoming, opened into the same gloom-filled space. Wemmick, his clerk, greeted me with a short nod and immediately went back to scribbling at his desk. His face was pale, composed, his hair perfectly parted, and his pen never stopped moving. "Mr. Jaggers will see you shortly," he said. When I was finally called in, Jaggers didn't offer me a seat. He paced. He dictated terms. Again, about my finances. He spoke of figures, limits, and obligations. "You will keep accounts," he said, tapping a paper. "I will review them. I do not permit foolishness." He spoke as if kindness was a weakness, as if control was the only form of safety. But what I noticed most that day was the line of clients outside his office. Men and women of every shape and shadow lined up like ghosts, hoping for resurrection. Jaggers ruled them like a sovereign judge, and they waited with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. One woman even tried to grab his wrist as he passed. He shook her off coldly and told Wemmick, "Let her in tomorrow. Not today. I want her fear to settle." And Wemmick wrote it down, without blinking. But as we left the office that evening, something strange happened. Wemmick offered to walk me home, or rather, to his own home, if I cared to visit. He lived far out, past the city's sooty heart. I agreed, and there, in a modest little cottage with a wooden drawbridge and tiny garden, Wemmick changed. He smiled, he joked, he fed the chickens, he introduced me to the aged P, his nearly deaf father, who lived with him like a fragile treasure. "Home is home," Wemmick said. "We don't talk shop here." His walls were lined with curios and odd little inventions. It was whimsical, peaceful, full of life. "Everything here is built with my own hands," he added proudly. "Bit by bit, I live for the aged and myself. That's enough." I was stunned. This man, cold, mechanical at work, was warm and playful at home. It was like meeting two people wearing the same face. When I asked him about the contrast, he smiled faintly. In London, you wear armor. Here, you take it off. That night, as I returned to Barnard's Inn, I thought about what it meant to have two lives, one for the world and one for yourself, and I wondered which one I was building. Weeks passed, and I began to find a delicate rhythm in my new life among the pockets. Each day held a mix of lessons, polite introductions, and quiet competition. I observed my fellow students closely. Bentley Drummle, the heavy, prideful fellow whose every sluggish movement seemed to weigh more than words, and Startop, with his delicate, affected manner, seemingly coddled by a doting mother. Startop's company was easier to bear. We often shared conversations as we rowed along the Thames in the golden evenings. Me, struggling to keep pace. He, light and graceful. Drummle, by contrast, lurked behind on the riverbank, seeming more amphibian than human, his presence awkward and unwelcome. But the constant presence beside me was Herbert. His warmth grounded me through every awkward tea, every stifling social moment. He was an ally, a mirror, and more than anything, a friend. One afternoon, two guests arrived at Mr. Pocket's home. Camilla Pocket, his sister, and Georgiana, the rigid cousin I had once seen through shadowed doorways at Satis House. Their civil smiles revealed their disdain, their forced politeness shrouding contempt. Their eyes lingered on me too long, as if calculating advantage. Their presence reminded me, sharply, that my new world came with whispers and watchful glances. At night, money slipped through my fingers. London life demanded more than book smarts. Societal expectations needed new clothes. Proper meals expenses I met with a growing headache. Thankfully, Herbert remained steady, guiding me through the maze. Then, one evening, I remembered Wemmick's dinner invitation. I wrote a note. He was delighted. That night, I followed him through the city's gloom to his extraordinary home, his castle in Walworth. There, I stepped into a different world. Wemmick's cottage looked like a miniature fortress. Drawbridge, moat, turrets built by his own hands, by ingenuity and solitude. In a cosy bower, a whimsical little lake brimmed with punch, circled by paths of ingenuity. Wemmick stood proudly before it, declaring himself carpenter, plumber, gardener, jack of all trades. In the hearth-warmed living space sat a gentle old man, the aged parent, deaf but delighted by every nod Pip made, every small motion of recognition. From me, Wemmick's smile softened around him. Home meant tenderness and openness. Dinner followed. Conversation sparkled. Wemmick showed me oddities, criminal artifacts, carved trinkets, tobacco stoppers, a mishmash of the law and life. Then, at exactly 9, a red-hot poker was set to ignite a cannon outside. The clap shook the cottage, and every teacup rang. "He's fired!" the aged cried, joyfully shouting. I heard him. Morning brought quiet. Breakfast was gentle. But as Wemmick and I tread back toward the office, his face hardened, and his posture stiffened the warm. Wemmick slipped away, replaced by the clerk again. That evening captured two worlds in one man. The office cold, guarded, controlled. The castle alive, loving, crafted with care. As I returned to Barnard's Inn, I understood. One must learn to wear both faces, where society demands, yet keep a sanctuary untouched. Mr. Jaggers summoned me with Herbert, Startop, and Drummle to his house for dinner. The invitation felt more like a summons than a gesture of hospitality, as though we were to be observed, not entertained. His home was somber and stone-faced, much like the man himself. Inside, It was dim, heavy with silence, and smelled faintly of old papers and soap. Jaggers entered precisely on time, washed his hands and face with slow, methodical care, and dried them with equal precision. Each movement seemed to cleanse not just dirt, but something deeper like guilt. He did not ask us about ourselves. He simply seated us at the table. Drummle slouched, face dull and thick with self-importance. Startop, more refined, answered politely when spoken to. Herbert and I exchanged quiet glances, both grateful for each other's company. The food was rich, but the atmosphere tighter than the knots in Jaggers's napkin. Midway through dinner, Jaggers called in his housekeeper. She entered without a word, Molly, a pale, quiet woman with an odd, wary grace. Without explanation, Jaggers grabbed her wrist and held it out to us like a strange exhibit. The room fell still. Her wrist was long and sinewy, her muscles powerful beneath the skin. There were scars, old ones, healed but not forgotten. Jaggers made a brief comment on her strength, then let her go. She vanished without a sound. The gesture unsettled me more than any argument could. Later, Jaggers turned to Drummle with something like admiration. The Spider, he called him in private. An odd name, one that suited Drummle's slow, creeping arrogance. He warned me that Drummle was dangerous. "Keep your eye on him," he said. "You'll find he stings." After dinner, tensions rose. Drummle mocked Startop. Startop flushed and responded sharply. Words grew sharper, heavier, just as the mood darkened beyond recovery. Jaggers stood. "9:30, he said coolly. "Gentlemen, we are done." And just like that, the night ended. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange need to apologize for the discomfort. Jaggers waved it off. "I like the Spider," he said. His words lingered like smoke. Days later, Drummle left the Pocket household. Quietly, without ceremony, I watched him go with relief. But a part of me stayed unsettled, not just because of who Drummle was, but because of who Jaggers admired him to be. And in that moment, I began to understand. Power doesn't always admire goodness. Sometimes it respects only strength, no matter how cruel. One morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was crooked. The ink smudged. The greeting, simple. "Dear Pip, I am coming up to London to see you. Your ever humble friend, Joe." My heart stirred, but not entirely with joy. I should have been excited. I should have wanted to see Joe, but something in me hesitated. In London, I had begun to polish my voice, my clothes, my manners. I had started to think like a gentleman, or at least someone pretending to be one. And Joe, dear, honest Joe, did not fit into that world. Still, I arranged for him to meet me at Barnard's Inn. The morning he arrived, I stood at the window, watching for his figure in the crowd. When I saw him, hat too small, coat too stiff, gait awkward, my heart tightened with guilt. He knocked gently, almost as if afraid of the door. "Pip," said, eyes bright with affection. "How grand you look." I smiled, but awkwardly. He looked around the room as though afraid to disturb something expensive. His hat refused to sit still in his hands. His boots squeaked. I offered him tea, and he held the cup like it might shatter if he gripped it wrong. His small talk felt forced. He told me Biddy sent her regards. Mrs. Joe was still recovering. The forge was busy, but his voice shook with something unsaid. Finally, after fumbling a sugar spoon twice, he cleared his throat. "The reason I came is to bring a message. From Miss Havisham, she would like to see you," he said. "And Estella is home." The name hit me like a chord struck too hard. Estella, back at Saty's house. Joe smiled faintly. She's grown beautiful, they say. I nodded, trying to keep my expression calm. But inside, I was already packing bags, already imagining her voice. Then silence stretched between us. I wanted to fill it, to say something kind. But pride or shame held me still. Joe stood up. "You've a full plate now, Pip," he said gently. "London life is no place for the likes of me. So, I'll take myself away." I protested too late, too unconvincingly. He shook my hand. "You're always in my heart, Pip. Always." And with that, he left. I sat alone after the door closed, tea untouched. All I could think of was how I had made the best man I'd ever known feel like he didn't belong in my life. After sending Joe away, guilt draped over me like a shadow. Determined to atone, I planned to return to the village the next day to see Miss Havisham, visit Biddy, perhaps make things right with Joe's gentle heart. Yet, when morning came, I found excuses instead. Sitting in the dim parlour of the Blue Boar Inn, in rooms faintly warmed by a single candle, I convinced myself I couldn't be burden on Joe. I was too restless, too worried about missing Miss Havisham. So I stayed at the inn, telling myself this kindness was for others, but deep inside, I knew I was fooling myself. I had become a self-swindler, deceiving the one person I should trust most. When the coach to the village arrived, I climbed aboard with hesitation in my bones. Inside, 2 convicts rode with an armed guard, hulking men bound for the hulks. My pulse spiked when I recognized one. It was the same man who had given me 2 golden £1 notes behind the 3 Jolly Bargemen, the day I helped a stranger in the marsh. My face drained when he sat near me, as if fate itself leaned in. They spoke quietly. The convict's companion mentioned that a boy had been given the £2 on orders from his fellow convict, both money and file, repaid, payment for an act of mercy in the dark. The convict agreed he was a fool, and he had been caught trying to escape again. A life sentence. He uttered it like a final sentence for both crime and kindness. A chill crawled over me. My throat constricted. I slid off the coach at the next stopping point, trembling, stuffing myself into anonymity, thankful for the hush of the village streets. Inside the inn, in trembling hands, I held a battered local paper. My name was there, but not my own doing. Pumblechook had claimed credit as my first benefactor, calling himself the architect of my transformation, playing the role of founder with bragging flair. I closed my eyes. I was lost between 2 worlds, one molded by gratitude, the other by guilt and ambition. It was a grey, windless morning when I returned to Saty's house. The road from the Blue Boar twisted like memory through the village, and as I approached the worn iron gates, I felt a strange weight gather behind my ribs. The house stood just as I remembered. Time had not touched its broken windows, nor softened the jagged ivy that clawed up its walls. It looked, if anything, more like a ruin than before, but my heart beat faster, because I knew within those walls she was waiting. Estella. The gates creaked open, and I passed under the twisted trees of the garden. The stone path was cracked with moss, and the air carried a faint sweetness of rot and roses. It felt like stepping back in time into a place where nothing had ever changed, where emotions had hardened into habit. In the dim hallway, I heard voices, and then I saw her. Estella stood at the foot of the stairs, bathed in a muted light from a dusty window above. She was no longer the cruel-eyed child who had once scorned my boots and hands. She had grown into herself tall, poised, strikingly beautiful, with eyes that saw everything but offered little. Her presence stopped the world. She extended her gloved hand with cool grace. "You are not a boy anymore, Pip." I took her hand. It was warm, but distant. "And you," I said quietly, "are everything I remembered, and more." We stood like that for a moment, strangers held together by memory, and something stranger, hope, maybe, or the shape of what might have been. Then Miss Havisham called from within the drawing room. We entered. She sat as always, frozen in her yellowing gown, surrounded by stopped clocks, and a wedding feast turned to dust. Her eyes, sharp as pins, locked onto mine. "Look at her, Pip," she said. "Do you see what I've made?" Estella said nothing. "She is a lady now," Miss Havisham went on, voice trembling with something between pride and rage. "Raised to break hearts, yours, theirs, all of them." The silence that followed made me dizzy. Then Estella turned to me. "Would you walk with me, Pip?" Outside, we strolled through the tangled garden. Roses grew wild along the path. Their petals had faded, but their thorns remained sharp. She moved with effortless grace, and yet I sensed something guarded in her every step. "Miss Havisham tells me," I said, "that you are going to France." She nodded. "For a while, to finish what she calls my education. And then," she looked at me carefully, "and then, perhaps, I shall be married to someone suitable." Her words landed like stones in my chest. I tried to respond, but nothing came. We reached the edge of the garden. A rusted gate leaned crookedly between us and the marshes. She turned to face me. "Pip," she said, "you must understand something." "What?" "I have no heart." I shook my head. "You only say that because she told you to." "No," Estella replied. "I say it because it is true. I feel nothing for anyone." I stood silent. I have been trained to win affection and to cast it away. I've seen how it weakens people, makes them foolish. It's not for me. "But," I began, then stopped. I wanted to tell her I loved her, that I had loved her since I was a child, that every step I took in life had pointed toward her, but she had already turned away. "I will see you again, perhaps," she said, "after France." Back at the front gate, she turned one last time. "Farewell, Pip." Then she disappeared into the house, its dark windows swallowing her whole. I stood outside for a long time, staring at the twisted iron gate. All I could feel was the ache of longing, and the knowledge that I would follow that ache wherever it led. The morning air in London carried a curious chill, as though the city itself paused to catch its breath before revealing another secret. I rose early and went to Mr. Jaggers, feeling suddenly responsible for more than just my own fate. "Mr. Jaggers," I began, finding my voice on a whisper, I wanted to tell you about Orlick." Jaggers looked up with a curious calm. "Mr. Orlick?" he said, dryly. "Certainly not someone suited to serve Miss Havisham, is he?" I nodded, uncertain. "He has history," I stammered. "Things I knew long ago." Without a flicker of surprise, Jaggers replied, "I'll see him paid off. That office must not be held by unscrupulous men." He stood, dismissing me without ceremony. There were no gestures of thanks, no promises of reward, only the quiet, unyielding power of his judgment. Stepping back into the streets, London greeted me without mercy. The tailor's apprentice, Trabb's boy, spotted me my fine coat, my air of anxious confidence, and erupted into mockery. He followed me down the road, copying my posture, my speech. It wasn't cruel, it was devastating. The boy unveiled my pretensions with contemptuous clarity. I felt my cheeks burn hotter than the summer sun outside. Humiliated, I fled, bypassing Joe's shop as though my name, spoken in gratitude, would catch me in my guilt. But guilt has wings. That very evening, I arranged for a barrel of oysters and a codfish to be delivered to Joe, a peace offering for treating him as a stranger, packaged in silence. Later, in the quiet of Barnard's Inn, I confessed everything to Herbert. I love her, I admitted. Estella. He looked at me, not with surprise, but with gentle concern. Pip, he said. I suspected it. I blushed. But, does Miss Havisham want us to marry? Herbert shook his head. She's never conditioned your expectations on marriage. And Estella, she's been shaped. I fear for you, Pip. You might only be headed toward heartbreak. My heart tightened. I tried to push the thought away. Herbert continued quietly. Maybe it's time to detach, to preserve your peace. I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. Detaching. Sounds impossible. Herbert nodded gently. I understand, and I'll support you either way. He paused, then said, on a brighter note, I have some news. My eyes flicked toward him. I'm engaged, he said, voice lightening. To Clara. She lives with her father. He's ill. A complicated situation, but I want her. Eventually, with work, we'll be married. A warmth touched my chest, proud for him. Hopeful for us both. Still, my thoughts drifted toward one face, one longing, and one locked door that felt achingly close, yet forever barred. One evening, Herbert and I decided to leave behind our books and the quiet halls of our lodgings to go to the theatre. We had received a small, oddly printed playbill saying Hamlet and that our townsman, Mr. Wopsle, was performing the lead. Curiosity and perhaps compassion drove us there. The theatre was dim and narrow, the audience restless. When Wopsle appeared, his Hamlet was a catastrophe of passionless recitation, misremembered lines, and misplaced flourish. He climbed the stage like a man trying to remember tasks he'd never learned, leaving the crowd between laughter and shock. I cringed, not for me, but for the man attempting such grand tragedy. Herbert nudged me during one line, saying in a whisper, "He doesn't know he is failing, does he?" I shook my head, unable to answer, without betraying both pity and embarrassment. After the hopeless performance came the exit, bathed in awkwardness. Herbert and I tried to slip away quietly, but Mr. Wopsle, oblivious to the audience's reaction, spotted us and invited us backstage. His eyes shone with pride, as though he had delivered the greatest soliloquy ever uttered. He asked, "Well, how did I do?" Herbert offered a gentle smile. "Very moving," he said. I swallowed. "Powerful reading," I managed. He beamed. Moved by his oblivious joy, I impulsively invited him to dinner. He accepted, delighted, recounting the production's every misstep and every audience cadence as though they were triumphs. Sitting across from him at dinner, his face animated, voice booming. Long past when social grace required an end, I felt a mixture of tenderness and deep sadness. Here was a man chasing art as if it could reclaim lost significance, as if every misread line could be forgiven by sheer will. I thought about my own masquerade, the grandeur I tried to wear like clothes, hoping they would fit, hoping I might become someone else. That night, when I finally went to bed, my rest was uneasy. I dreamed of a stage too broad, a tragedy with no audience, where I was Hamlet saying lines I didn't feel, acting a part I could never mean. I woke with that ache of self-doubt. Am I improving? Am I merely performing? A trembling letter arrived one morning, carried on thin paper, nearly translucent. It bore Estella's handwriting. "Pip, come tomorrow at midday to the coach office. Miss Havisham has arranged your meeting." My heart thudded as though eager to escape its prison. The world around me blurred, and I nearly dropped the note. Finally, I set myself firmly to go, even if it meant arriving hours before she did. The next day, I stood at the coach terminus long before the noon sun climbed overhead. I paced, anxious and awkward, watching for every carriage that rolled in until the lady at the ticket booth scolded me as if I were loitering. I stiffened, flushed, and waited still. Then, by chance, I met Wemmick bowing his head in greeting, as though no more remarkable than a gardener greeting a new bloom. "Going somewhere interesting?" he asked softly. I managed, voice hushed. "I'm to meet Estella." His eyes sparkled, but he only nodded. "Perfect timing. Come with me a while. I'll show you something." Quick before she arrives. I followed him, curiosity convicting me with guilt. He led me through narrow alleys to a damp, gated building. "This is Newgate," he said. We stepped inside. The air was dank, thick with regret and despair. Chains dripped with rust. Hardened faces peered from behind bars. Wemmick moved among them like a gardener, among plants solemn, respectful, knowledgeable. A prisoner called out his name, and Wemmick greeted him gently. Another clasped his hands, asking for news of his case. Wemmick replied with calm certainty, encouraging hope, refusing to stoke false flames. The place was awful, oppressive, and yet strangely familiar to me. I felt as though a part of my past had followed me into this moment of longing. Wemmick led me out as quietly as he'd brought me in. "Take a moment, Pip," he whispered outside the gloom. "Remember that life has costs. You're stepping into a world of privilege now, but never forget those you've touched or harmed." I nodded, breathless, wiping the prison dust from my coat. Back at the station, the midday light changed my reflection, but it couldn't erase what I had just seen. Then she came. Estella appeared from behind a carriage, her mantle brushing the gravel, eyes distant yet clear. She glanced at me, expression smooth as glass. She walked over without a greeting, her presence both command and dismissal. In that moment, everything else fell away. I arrived at the coach office in London long before the midday hour, as though trying to hold time itself at bay. My heart thudded with anticipation and dread. When Estella emerged from the carriage, she was more striking than ever, tall, elegant, regal. Her beauty stunned me, but her composure was colder, measured. "You and I," she said quietly, extending a hand. "We have no choice but to obey our instructions. We must do as Miss Havisham has arranged." Her words landed like stones in my chest. They revealed not affection, but duty. She instructed me to fetch tea and then accompany her to Richmond, where she was to be introduced into society by a lady of rank. Our movement was scripted, precise, raised to follow commands, not our own desires. While she spoke, I tried to detect nuance in her tone, searching for a hint of tenderness. Instead, I found resolve. I wanted to plead, but I merely obeyed. Estella spoke also of Miss Havisham's relatives, including Sarah, Georgiana, and Camilla Pocket, how they despised me, and how they indulged in gossip and jealousy. Estella found it amusing, even liberating, that their plots against me failed. They wasted breath in plots, while I stood apart, honestly. It struck me that she derived a cold pleasure from their jealousy, and I felt small again, though clothed in fine garments. In that private room, with tea cooling between us, I leaned forward. "Miss Havisham speaks well of me, doesn't she?" Estella's eyes flickered. She said, "She trusts you more than they do." Then, with a tender cruelty, Estella allowed me to kiss her cheek. The brief warmth of her skin left me breathless, a lie and a truth. I escorted her to a waiting carriage, guiding her silently through fogged lamps and quiet streets. My chest felt hollow. I thought how safe I would feel if I could stay by her side forever. I watched her carriage roll away, pale light catching on lace, carriage lamps glowing, Estella seated as if in a dream I might never reach. Returning to the Pocket household, I expected comfort, answers, some firm heart to hold. Instead, Mrs. Pocket fussed about a missing packet of needles. The baby had likely swallowed them. The irony was sharp. A teacher of infancy fumbling her own child's mischief. I felt deflated, disillusioned. Here I was, tangled in expectations thrust upon me by Miss Havisham and Estella, yet back in a home where even the lessons taught were hollow. I realized how alone I had become, a gentleman in clothes, but not in peace. The day dawned cold and grey, shrouded in the weight of words unspoken. I travelled home for the first time since my sister's death. The village streets were quiet, and the sight of the forge felt piercing, like walking into an older, simpler version of myself. My dress coat felt alien in such familiar surroundings. Mr. Trabb, in his overzealous grief, had orchestrated the funeral with showy pomp. The forge's parlour was decked in black drapery, and villagers marched in solemn procession. Men with large bows under their chins stalked through the house as if on trial. I felt like a stranger in my own past. Inside the crowded room, I turned and saw Joe. His voice quivered as he suggested I sleep in my childhood room. I nodded, trying to look composed. Later, I found Biddy at the kitchen door. She welcomed me with mug and crust, quiet comfort. In private, I reproached her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She looked at me steadily. "I didn't think you wanted to know," she said. Her tone was gentle, but the truth cut deeper. She added quietly, "Joe loves you quietly, without complaint, and I've always watched to see when you'd come home." I felt a wash of guilt. For leaving, for forgetting. The funeral procession moved on toward the churchyard, where Mrs. Joe lay in the ground. Larks called above us. Light filtered softly through swaying branches. I couldn't help but feel I had given a hollow tribute to someone who'd shaped me. Difficult though she was, Pumblechook hovered close, tugging at my sleeve, arranging my hatband with condescending pride. I wanted to shake off the attention. I thought of how far I had wandered, not just from home, but from humility, from the person I had been. After the ceremony passed and the villagers dispersed, Joe invited me inside for a simple dinner. He handled knife and fork with care, as though afraid to break the stillness. Before leaving the house, I paused in the doorway of my old room. The night's mist curled around my ankles. Biddy stood with me, facing the glow of the forge embers. "You promise you'll come again, Pip?" I swallowed. "Yes," I said, though my voice trembled. She nodded, but I sensed the quiet question behind her words. I watched the mist rise as I walked away. It enveloped me, hiding the flicker of something I wasn't sure I'd be brave enough to return to. The day I turned 21, a silence seemed to fall over London, as though the city itself paused to acknowledge my coming of age. I spent the morning restless, half-dressed, pacing the narrow corridors of Barnard's Inn. It was a strange feeling being officially an adult, yet still uncertain of who I was meant to become. Shall I be called Mr. Pip? I wondered. And what would that mean? For Herbert, for Estella, and for Joe. At precisely 5 in the afternoon, I found myself summoned to Mr. Jaggers's office. The familiar door opened to the oppressive gloom of his outer chambers. Wemmick congratulated me with a half nod, his professional calm unwavering. The air smelled faintly of ink and damp paper. When I entered Jaggers's inner room, he greeted me with a clipped nod. "So it is that I must call you Mr. Pip today," Congratulations." He said it with such weight that the age seemed not a gift, but a verdict. He paced slowly, eyes drifting over the room's grim ornaments, dismembered casts, cold shadows. "Now, my young friend," he said, voice low and calculating, "you must consider your spending." Jaggers's words were surgical. I shook my head and admitted I didn't know how much I spent. He nodded. "I thought so." Then, after brief hesitation, he produced a folded banknote. "This is yours," he announced. £500 a year from now, until the benefactor appears." He added that I could withdraw 125 per quarter, and with that, I was left to manage my own fortune. I stared at the generous note, heart fluttering with gratitude and fear. I expected more answers, secrets, at least a name. But Jaggers remained silent. He reminded me I mustn't ask for more. Then, without warmth, he accepted my invitation to dinner. I left that office feeling richer in coin, yet poorer in certainty. On my way back, I stopped by Wemmick's station again. In the office mode, he frowned at my plan. "Portable property is not to be invested in friends," he warned in that clipped, logical voice. "It's thrown into the Thames." He shook his head. I noticed, though, that his voice softened when he spoke of the possibility at Walworth. I promised I would visit him there soon, hoping for the version of Wemmick that smiled. That evening, Mr. Jaggers came to dine with Herbert and me. We poured wine, but the words fell hollow. His presence, reserved and intense, cast a chill across the table, the meal as somber as a funeral repast. When he left, the two of us sat in uneasy silence, feeling the weight of adulthood pressing in. As I lay sleepless that night, I held the banknote between my fingers. £500. Freedom. Prison, depending on how I used it. And above all, a vast unknown. Who was the benefactor who waited in the shadows to reveal themselves? It was a Sabbath afternoon when I made my second pilgrimage to Wemmick's castle, a maiden breakfast of purpose and loyalty in my heart. The walk to Walworth felt short on the map, but social expectation made it feel endless. When I reached the gates, their iron lift and drop tumble of noise delivered me into a realm where function became delight. The aged parent greeted me at the drawbridge. His voice, as brittle as worn parchment, quavered in greeting. "My son, sir. He expected your visit." He secured the bridge with the kind of ceremony one might reserve for royalty, and we entered the flickering warmth of the chamber beyond. I sat, uncertain and humble, while the aged warmed hands by the hearth. He told me of his life before the warehouses of Liverpool, his hard hearing, his need to withdraw from public life, and how Wemmick redirected himself toward law, eventually constructing this sanctuary stone by imaginative stone. And then Wemmick himself appeared, accompanied by Miss Skiffins, radiant in green gloves and proper reticence. The pair passed through hidden flaps marked John and Miss Skiffins. Mechanical surprises, summoned by unseen levers, charming, informal little tricks that made me smile without realizing. We settled for tea. The aged poured toast from a mountain of buttered slices, and for a moment the two settings, Jaggers's oppressive office and Wemmick's warm home, merged in comforting absurdity. I watched Wemmick attempt to slip an arm around Miss Skiffins's waist. She gently removed it and laid it on the table, her grace making gentle correction more powerful than a rebuke. I spoke, heart heavy with intent. "Mr. Wemmick, Herbert needs something, a chance, a platform, and if I could help him, he'd flourish as I could never alone." There was a quiet pause. Then Wemmick's voice softened. "Well, that is very fine of you." No bursts. "Then you'll help me?" He nodded. "My business is not sentiment but this, done in Walworth is personal. I will speak with my acquaintance at Clarica's, and we'll set something up. Don't fear noise or credit, Herbert will know nothing. Hot with relief, I grasped his hand. He smiled. This will brush away some Newgate cobwebs, won't it? The aged chuckled in agreement, arrowing toast onto a plate with childlike pleasure. When afternoon turned to evening and carriage rides beckoned, I departed, carrying not hope only, but redemption for someone I cared for. Later, in my rooms, I dreamed that Pip's great expectations finally did good for someone else. And in that moment, the ambition I had treated as pantomime became something worth sustaining. The following days unfolded with quiet assurance. I began to see Herbert more often slim, eager, and ever grateful, and I watched him transform under my humble sponsorship. Wemmick's discreet introduction to Mr. Clarica's firm provided him a foothold. The young Herbert was invited aboard as a junior partner, with a modest retainer and the respect of men who valued skill, not birthright. One evening, as the candles burned low in our room at Barnard's Inn, he spoke between puffs of his meerschaum pipe. "Pip, you've changed my world," he said softly. "No grand charity, just a friend who believed in me. That's worth more than half my expectations." I smiled, though my chest ached. Success shared, anchored by authentic care, that's what I had hoped for, and now it lay before me. London, in turn, looked gentler. The air felt less heavy. When I walked past the Thames, or paused by candlelight, I no longer felt the same urgency driving me forward. My expectations had begun to settle into something sustainable, something kind, something real. At Jaggers's office, he quizzed me one afternoon, as cold and precise as ever. "Is Clarica's accepting him?" "Yes," I replied. "Excellent," Jaggers said, voice flat but approving. "It's a practical placement. Keep it discreet." His words, though few, filled me with relief. Here was competence, silently acknowledged by the most unyielding man I knew. Soon after, I received a letter from Wemmick Inc., jaunty and informal. "Your business here is done. Herbert is afloat and steering. Come by Walworth whenever free, there's supper waiting, and the aged wants to hear of your adventures." I stepped into Wemmick's cottage that evening, as though stepping into a friendlier version of myself. The aged, hearing my voice, rose and pressed my hand, muffled with joy. "My heart hears the sound again," he said. I stayed for supper, piping hot stew, laughter, and the gentle glow of hearthlight. Wemmick and I exchanged progress in frank candour, untethered from legal guile. It was simple, honesty, easy as breathing. That night, returning to my chamber, I paused before a candle I'd left burning. I thought of Joe, grounded by love, of Biddy, steadfast and forgiving, and of Estella, distant and frozen in beauty. But for the first time, I felt enough. Enough expectation, enough forgiveness, and enough hope to let the rest unfold. Pip was 23 and had settled into a modest flat in the Temple, shared peacefully with Herbert. That evening, Herbert was away on business, leaving Pip alone to stare into the fire. Rain struck the windows, and the wind howled outside, as though nature were bearing down on his restless heart. Around midnight, the house fell still until a cautious knock trembled through the door. "Who is it?" A rough voice answered, "It's me, Pip." Fear surged in my throat as I unbolted the door. There, drenched and weather-beaten, stood the man who haunted my childhood, the escaped convict. His eyes softened when they found mine. "My noble Pip," he said quietly, voice low with emotion. "You look like a gentleman." Long silence followed. I stared at those familiar features hardened yet with a hint of gratitude, and my foundation trembled. He stepped inside as though it were his right, shaking off rain and dread. "I've been to New South Wales," he began, "toiled and saved, and I set myself to make something of you." He spoke of Jacob Eagle being gone, and of Wemmick and Jaggers dealing with the arrangement. The truth fell like ice. He was not only alive, but he was my benefactor. Every shilling that paid for my schooling, my clothes, my indulgence came from him. I reeled. All I'd built, my hopes, my illusions, they shattered in whispering crackles. I saw myself, ashamed, diminished. I had turned my back on Joe, on Biddy, on honesty for the promise of love that never existed. Pip shook his head, voice breaking. I'm sorry." The convict nodded, saddened, not angry. "I loved you, Pip," he said. "What you did for me, noble Pip. I carried that memory through every hardship." I offered him water. He drank, hand trembling, before holding mine. "You're my second father now," he said quietly. Time steps backward. Fear flooded me. "But you'll be caught," I whispered. He nodded. "If they find me, it's death." I felt the weight settle in my chest, the moral gravity, the debt of gratitude, the danger coiling around us both. Pip closed the shutters and led him to Herbert's bedroom, setting him to rest on the bed left empty. He bolted the doors and sat beside the fire, heart thundering, mind racing with grief, guilt, and a fractured elation. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, destiny's turn had changed everything. The next morning broke with Pip's heart still heavy from the storm-filled revelation of the night before. Alone in his temple chambers, he moved as though through a dream, each footstep carrying the weight of his secret. He nearly stumbled over a dark shape crouched in the hallway just outside. For a moment, Pip froze, dread curling through him. Then, gathering courage, he ran to fetch the watchman. By the time they returned with a lantern, the figure was gone. The watchman, stoic and dutiful, reported that he had admitted 2 men the previous evening, one resembling Pip's uncle, but had no way of knowing whether they lingered undetected. In a haze of anxiety, Pip turned back to Magwitch, who was settling awkwardly in Pip's modest parlour. Desperate for cover, Pip whispered the story he had conjured. "You are my uncle, unusually like me in voice and gesture." Magwitch seemed to understand. "I am known here as Provis. My real name, Abel Magwitch." A convulsion of shock shuddered through Pip. Magwitch's confession tumbled out. He had returned from New South Wales, watched Pip rise to gentility, and come despite the grave risk to see the gentleman he had made. Fear flooded Pip for his reputation, for Magwitch's safety, for everything tattered between gratitude and dread. Still, honour swelled inside him. He resolved to shield Magwitch, blur his tracks from unfriendly eyes. Later, he fetched a cloak, hat, and glasses to disguise the man. Each article felt hollow but necessary. He could not erase their danger. He could only try to soften its impact. In the afternoon, Pip called on Jaggers with measured urgency. He tested prose carefully. "Is everything I was told true?" Jaggers listened, expression unreadable, then nodded. "Yes, Provis is in New South Wales. We arranged so as not to confess otherwise. Your assumptions were wrong. No evidence ever suggested Miss Havisham as your benefactor." Pip's breath trembled as he realized how far illusions had carried him and how firmly reality had struck. As he left, Jaggers nodded quietly, leaving Pip alone with the knowledge that the law stood close, unrelenting, but silent for now. Returning home, Pip entered to find Magwitch sitting back in the lamp's glow, disguised but not transformed. The convict looked up, eyes reflecting relief and pride. "It's you, Pip," he said gently. Pip knelt beside him. Wordlessly, he made a promise to protect, to repay, to carry the weight of gratitude and guilt both. Outside, temple church bells tolled as the sun dipped low. Inside, a new story had begun, one cloaked in danger, dignity, and the fragile urgency of human loyalty. The afternoon light in my temple rooms felt brittle, as though the air itself held its breath. I sat by the fire, heart heavy in the hush of what I had uncovered. Magwitch's presence lingered like a shadow in the corner. Then Herbert returned, weary from business, and the hush gave way to urgent murmurs in the quiet parlor. "Herbert," I began, voice trembling. "I've done wrong." He froze, saw the convict on the chair, and the words tumbled out. The revelation that the man was Abel Magwitch, the escaped convict and the hidden benefactor who had made me a gentleman, was the sort of truth that unseated worlds. For a long moment, Herbert sat silent, his face etched with shock, pity, and a keen understanding. "You must stop being so indebted to him," he finally said. "But think, if you refuse him now, if you give up, you might drive him to something desperate." I nodded, pain twisting inside me. He was right. Magwitch had risked everything, his safety, his life, to see the results of his sacrifices. I could not cut him off, not unless I wanted to shatter that hope, that hard-won dignity. So we crafted a plan in hushed tones that respected both loyalty and caution. First, I would gently refuse any more money from him. I didn't want to remain dependent on a convict's generosity. Second, Magwitch must leave England. The law closed in faster than mercy. If he stayed, capture and hanging were inevitable. Herbert looked at me steadying. We resolved. Pip would accompany him abroad, far from peril, until Magwitch's presence could be safely severed and forgotten. I felt relief and sorrow. Relief that some control returned. Sorrow for the cost of it. Then I went to fetch Magwitch from his chair and found him softened by age. Not the man of threat, but a man shaped by gratitude and regret. I explained, "I cannot accept more of your generosity, and you must leave. England is dangerous for you." He simply nodded, sorrow and love mingling in his eyes. "I knew you'd do right," he said. We worked all that evening, arranging clothes, rationing funds, and rehearsing ways to elude notice. When night fell, Pip locked the doors and sat across from Magwitch. No words were spoken. Our silence was heavy with resolve, loyalty, and the aching grief of something treasured and nearly lost. The morning air in Pip's rooms was still, as though the world held its breath for what was to come. The candlelight flickered softly across the walls, illuminating dust motes that danced like restless spirits. Magwitch, Provis, as he'd asked to be called, sat by the hearth, face drawn and weary. Silence lay between them until Pip, gathering courage, finally spoke. "If you wish, tell me your story." Magwitch's shoulders sagged, and he looked into the fire, eyes distant. Then he began, voice low but steady. "I won't sing it out like a pretty tale. I'll give it to you short, and as honest as I can." He paused, swallowing. Then, "In jail and out of jail. In jail and out of jail. That's pretty much my life, boy. A child with nothing, nobody to name himself to, only to survive." Magwitch recalled being born into neglect, roaming the streets of Essex. He first thought he was called Abel, much as children learn bird names, not because anyone told him, but because they seemed real. He was taken up by the law so many times he grew used to it. He learned to read from a soldier in a roadside inn, and even a traveling magician taught him to write both small miracles to a boy with no future. But everything changed one night at Epsom races over 20 years before. There he met Compeyson, refined and smooth, wearing fine clothes and speaking like a gentleman. The man offered friendship, a turn toward respectability, but it was a snare. He was a tough man below that varnish. He set himself up as a gentleman, but he made me into his blind man. Along with Compeyson was another, named Arthur, a broken, dying soul tormented by hallucinations. He saw a bride in white, her heart broken, who haunted him with tears and a shroud. That was Arthur Havisham, Miss Havisham's brother, the ghost in those shadows. We'd all misunderstood the name Arthur, mixing it with tragedy and ghosts. Pip sat silent as Magwitch continued. We swindled rich people. Compeyson was always the planner. I was his muscle, blind to every trick. They were caught, tried separately. The courtroom, Magwitch said, weighed heavily on him, but lightly on Compeyson. The jury saw two opposite men, one common, one refined. Compeyson used his manners like armor. I could only stand there and take it. Compeyson, cunning and smooth, spoke a plea for mercy. Magwitch got 14 years, Compeyson only 7. That injustice formed the black flame of his revenge. Later, on the prison ship, Magwitch escaped. He tracked Compeyson down, wounded him in vengeance, then fled across seas. He became prosperous in Australia, all in the name of Pip, the boy who once called his name, whose small act of kindness gave him life. Silence stretched longer. Pip was shaking. Herbert nudged him with a note, quietly stating, "Young Havisham's name was Arthur. Compeyson is the man who jilted her." Pip looked at Herbert, heart aching. Fate had woven their lives tightly. Magwitch's face was pale, eyes weary but resolved. "I did it for you." Pip bowed his head. The fire crackled. Dust fell in a golden haze. The room held more than 2 men, it held history. I found myself standing by the road beneath a sky hung low with clouds, as though nature itself paused to mark that tangled moment. My heart throbbed with uneasy awareness. Was the hesitation I felt at harbouring Provis, the convict rooted in fear of how Estella might judge me? The contrast struck me sharply, cutting deeper than any sting. Estella's proud composure, so distant and unearned, beside this coarse, desperate man who had risked everything for my sake. I stood motionless, knowing no path would be smoothened by my reflections. No act would change fate. He would not be helped, nor would I find mercy in my own hesitation. In the thinness of that moment, a new dread took shape. Provis's story had gone beyond simple gratitude. It had handed flesh to my fears. If Compeyson still lived, and I almost choked at the thought discovery of Magwitch's return would bring ruin, not just to him, but to all I had built. Compeyson, with his polished manners and winning tongue, hid sinister intent behind gracious artifice. He'd served his sentence well like armor and moved on into society's grace, while Magwitch, who had known him for the brute he truly was, remained framed by injustice. Though I promised myself to keep Estella's name from Provis's ears, I felt that I owed him one last courtesy, a final visit to Satis house. I needed to see Miss Havisham and Estella perhaps to steal a moment of grace before I did what needed to be done. Convince Provis to vanish from England forever, under the pretense of needing better attire, a frivolous errand, a nightly last act before the ferry took him away. So that very night, I told Joe I must return home for comfort, I said. But the truth was, I slipped away into fog and intended to make that pilgrimage alone. I travelled at dawn, the coach wheeling me through mist and muted fields, each turn a hesitant beat of my own fear. By the time I reached the Blue Boar Inn, my heart hammered. And there, like an omen in man form, stood Bentley Drummle, lounging by the fire, looking every inch a gentleman with that slow, imperious arrogance. Our eyes met. Sharp regrets drafted between us. I ignored him behind my morning paper, though his presence blazed across the hearth. He stood so close, commanding the fire, that I felt my own warmth drain. We pretended not to notice, then propped ourselves side by side, two unwilling performers, in a quiet duel of resentment. He spoke, his voice thick. "Your country, is it not?" "Indeed." I clipped back. "I've often been told it resembles your Shropshire." "How?" He bristled with contempt but pressed on. "The lady won't go riding today," he said, calling the waiter. "I'm dining with her tonight." The phrase cut deeper than any sword. He was courting Estella. I tasted a bitterness I could not hide. I rose to escape the heat of that grim revelation. Still, I paused to sip at my tea, its warmth faint against the fire's glow. He rode off, smug, and I left, muted by the weight of that morning, lacking appetite or peace. The road to Satis house stretched before me like a swallowed hope. The morning sky was pale and still as Pip made his way once more to Satis house. His heart raced with dread and anticipation. For a moment, he paused on the threshold, wondering if this visit would help him find peace or stitch a new wound. Inside, the house remained in stately decay. Tattered curtains, wilted bridal flowers, and unmoving clocks warned him that time had long ago abandoned this place. Yet, the hall felt charged with expectation as he met her Miss Havisham in her faded gown and clipped greeting. "Why have you come?" she asked. Not unkindly, Pip inhaled and replied with steady resolve. "I know who my benefactor is. I have come to tell you so." Miss Havisham's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. He went on. "You led me into believing it was you who raised me. You let me dream I was destined for something grand. Tell me it was part of your plan?" She met his gaze with brittle candor. "Yes." Pip's heart turned cold. He pressed further. "Was it because Mr. Jaggers represented both you and my patron? A coincidence?" She answered softly, "A mere coincidence." And then, "Did you let me believe in your designs so as to torment others, your relatives?" Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice was firm. "Yes." Stinging anger and sorrow joined Piper's heart. "But not Herbert and Matthew Pocket. They have been kind to me, even when they thought I was favoured at your house, and laden lust in the crypts." Miss Havisham's expression flickered with something like real regret, though she did not speak. Turning to Estella, Pip said, voice low and urgent, "I have loved you all these years. I love you still." Estella's face was cool, unmoved. "I warned you I had no heart." He shook his head, desperation undercutting composure. "I hoped you did not mean it." Silence followed. Then, quietly, "I've decided," she said, "to marry Drummle." Pip winced at the name, for it sounded like betrayal. "Please," he begged, "if it cannot be me, choose someone better." Estella looked away, voice detached. "You can see, I have long felt what Miss Havisham wanted, but I am weary of it." Miss Havisham's eyes glistened. "Pip," she whispered fragilely, "I am sorry." No reply came. Pip turned and left. Every footstep back to London felt hollow. At a small gate, not far from his lodgings, a night porter slipped him a note, "Don't go home." And with that single line, Pip understood that tonight would end in a place far from home and far from innocence. After receiving Wemmick's urgent note, "Don't go home," I left my chambers at once and walked aimlessly through the city streets, too restless to return. London was thick with fog and uncertainty, the lamps flickering like fragile thoughts. I made my way toward Covent Garden and found a place I remembered from my childhood. The Hummums, a lodging house known for always having a bed, day or night. A sleepy porter led me to a small room near the baths, low-ceilinged, musty, with a heavy old bed so large that one leg stood in the fireplace and another blocked the door. The candlelight was dim, casting long shadows that trembled across the walls. I tried to rest, but the room itself seemed to resist sleep. The creaking of the wooden floorboards, the faint sound of steam hissing in the walls, the occasional sigh from the street all kept me alert. Worse still, my thoughts spun. I felt things crawling across my skin, phantoms of anxiety and exhaustion. The phrase from Wemmick's note haunted me. Don't go home. I imagined men waiting for me in the shadows of the temple, watching, prepared. Provis Magwitch was in danger, and so was I. My heart beat faster. Sleep came only in fits and starts, broken by dreams that felt like warnings. I'd wake, breathless, staring at the marks in the wallpaper, imagining they spelled out the same phrase, "Don't go home." At one point, I even convinced myself someone had died in this very room, perhaps by their own hand. I sat up, checked the sheets, walked to the door, then returned to bed, eyes wide and dry. By morning, I felt brittle and hollow. The porter knocked gently at 7. As arranged, I dressed and went straight to Walworth Wemmick's home. The moment he saw me, he smiled as if we were old friends meeting for tea. "You got my note, I see," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "That's why I'm here." We didn't speak about it directly, not yet. Wemmick offered me breakfast, a warm bowl of something simple, and I sat while the quiet domestic life of Walworth continued around us. The aged slept peacefully. Mary Ann passed through the kitchen without a word. Finally, Wemmick leaned in. "You're being watched," he said plainly. "Someone's interested in your rooms at the temple, someone you wouldn't want to meet." He didn't say how he knew, he never did, but I trusted him. He advised me not to return to the temple until we were sure the danger had passed. "I'll keep my ears open," he said. "Just don't go back there." "Not yet." I nodded. Wemmick added, "If you're smart, you'll make sure your friend, our friend, has his property secured. Portable property, as we say." His message was clear. Protect Magwitch's fortune. Anything could happen now. We shared a look of silent agreement. Jaggers might be the official man of law, but Wemmick, kind, clever Wemmick, was my ally in this fight. As I stood to leave, he reminded me softly, "Come back tonight. I'll know more then." I thanked him with the kind of gratitude words can't express, and stepped into the morning light, uncertain what the day might bring, but grateful not to face it alone. The morning dawned pale as Pip approached the lodging at Mill Pond Bank, the river's edge still shrouded in mists of hesitancy and fear. His heart passed a frightened rhythm, each breath whispering of danger. He paused before the door of Mrs. Wimple's lodgings, a modest facade that concealed the labyrinth of loyalties within. Inside, a backbone of quiet purpose guided him. Herbert was there, waiting in a parlour heavy with the scent of oil lamps and dust. He wore worry as gently as a friend, though his eyes held the steady resolve that Pip so sorely needed. "Clara is upstairs," Herbert said softly. "Shall I take you up?" Together, they climbed narrow stairs. The air thickened with tension, each step a passage toward peril and promise. At the top, behind a curtained door, Pip entered cautiously. There he saw her, Clara, Herbert's fiancée, gentle and caring as she attended to her father. The older man was nowhere in sight, though his presence lingered like a rum-laden fog. Every creak from above, every muffled grunt hinted at his existence. His absence shook Pip. This was who Clara endured each day, yet she met Pip with kindly composure, a soft smile that offered warmth where fear tried to dominate. Behind them, 2 rooms opened into each other. There sat Provis Abel Magwitch, looking more vulnerable than ever. He was at rest, vulnerable in a way Pip had scarcely dared to hope. The courtroom intensity had faded. Here was a man hiding with grace. Pip's limbs trembled. "I should warn you," he began, his voice quivering. "You are at risk. I received word someone from your past might be looking for you." Magwitch nodded slowly. He acknowledged the danger without question. Pip sat by him, hand trembling with loyalty and dread, and shared Wemmick's plan. "Herbert and I will row regularly by your window. If you lower the blind, we'll know you're safe. Then, one night, we'll help you into the boat, and you'll slip away without provoking suspicion." Herbert added quietly, "We'll practice the route together." He slipped into the corner, thoughtful, letting silence seal the plan. The air in the room was harsh with unspoken fears. Yet somewhere, beneath the ache, a chord of hope began to play. Pip lingered, wanting to stay, but the moment demanded action. He patted Magwitch's shoulder, a farewell and a vow woven into one. Then he slipped away into the muffled hush of the hall, leaving Provis Mr. Campbell behind the curtains, shielded for now, world-weary, yet protected by the promise of flight. The weeks that followed Magwitch's concealment passed slowly, each day steeped in tension. Though no visible danger presented itself, Pip's nerves remained taut, every hour shadowed by the knowledge that any step outside might be watched. Financially, Pip was nearing ruin. His debts began to press down on him, though he was determined never to touch the money that Magwitch had brought. Instead, he pawned his few remaining valuables, rings, trinkets, keepsakes from better days. He handed the unopened pocketbook, full of banknotes, to Herbert for safekeeping, insisting it remain sealed. Estella lingered in his thoughts, like a distant melody. Pip imagined she must now be married to Drummle, though he couldn't bear to confirm it. He avoided all mention of her name and asked Herbert to do the same. To pass the time and maintain the illusion of a normal life, Pip and Herbert continued their rowing along the Thames. These evening exercises were a cover, a way to watch over the river and monitor signs from Magwitch's window. But the wait for the right moment to smuggle him out of England stretched endlessly, fraying Pip's patience. One evening, feeling restless and seeking distraction, Pip went alone to the theatre. He hadn't been in some time. The familiar, dusty smell of the place, the murmur of the audience, the flickering stage lights, none of it eased his thoughts. On stage was Mr. Wopsle, now a comic actor in a local troupe. His performance was overly dramatic, comically off-mark, but Pip watched with quiet indulgence. Then, mid-scene, Wopsle faltered. His eyes widened, staring out into the audience straight at Pip. The actor's face drained of colour. After the show, Wopsle found Pip outside the theatre. His voice trembled. "You were in the house," he whispered, "and behind you, one seat was a man I've seen before. The convict, the one you helped in the marshes years ago." Pip's heart clenched. Compayson, the man who once stalked the marshlands of his childhood, who destroyed Miss Havisham, who betrayed Magwitch. He had found Pip, or perhaps he had never stopped watching. That night, Pip returned to the temple shaken. Every shadow lengthened with suspicion. He didn't sleep. He sent word to Wemmick, urging caution. Then, with Herbert, he discussed the plan anew. Every move from now on must be measured. The circle had begun to close. One evening, As I wandered home from my rowing mind restless, thoughts heavy, I crossed paths with Mr. Jaggers on the street. He greeted me with his customary precision. "Pip, may I invite you to dinner tomorrow evening? Wemmick will be present." I consented, startled by the invitation's gravity. That evening, I arrived at Jaggers's house, the rooms dim and fragrant with old leather and ink. Wemmick stood ready, seated at the table, decorous and attentive. When plates were cleared, Wemmick produced a sealed note. "Miss Havisham has requested your company," he said quietly, handing it to me. Jaggers raised his eyebrow but offered no sentiment. "She wishes to see you at your earliest convenience," said. A tremor rippled through me. Then Jaggers, with cold formality, moved to heavier matters. "The spider has succeeded," he commented. "Drummle has married Estella." My heart clenched, as if between his teeth. "I hardly know whether the stronger will win against the cunning," Jaggers added. "If Drummle resorts to force, he may triumph. If Estella uses her intellect, she might endure." I bowed my head. Later, Molly the housekeeper glided in. Her hands, though she moved with quiet grace, carried a hardened strength in their structure. I watched them, and then looked again at her eyes and jawline and thought, "Must be her. He's a cunning man." Jaggers commented lightly of Drummle, but who possesses real strength is yet to be proven. Dinner ended. Outside, I walked home with Wemmick at my side. I asked him softly about Molly's past. He hesitated, then quietly revealed. She was tried years ago for murder. Jaggers defended her, her strength disguised as frailty, the evidence carefully managed. She was acquitted, and from that moment remained in Jaggers's employ. I felt the weight of the revelation. Estella's mother had passed through this house in more ways than one. Wemmick smiled faintly. "What happens between you and me stays with me." The London night closed around us. I left with footsteps heavier than before, carrying the lightest and darkest truths entangled within me. One evening, while walking home after rowing, I crossed paths with Mr. Jaggers. His manner was precise, his tone measured. "Pip, will you dine with me tomorrow? Wemmick will join us." I agreed, surprised but too tense to question. That night, the dim corridors of Jaggers's home welcomed me. Leather-bound volumes sat along the walls, and old oil lamps cast flickering shadows. Wemmick was there, composed, attentive. After dinner, Wemmick presented me with a neatly sealed note. Jaggers merely nodded. "Miss Havisham requests your presence," Wemmick said softly. "At your convenience." My heart pounded. Then, Jaggers, cold and businesslike, added offhandedly, "Drummle is wed to Estella." The news struck me like a blow. I nodded, numb. He continued, "The strong may ultimately prevail, or the cunning. If he acts with force, he might win. If she wields intelligence, she may endure." Quiet absolved me nothing. Later, Molly Jaggers's housekeeper moved through the room. Her elegant hands, marred by strength, reminded me of another. Recognition struck deep. "He is clever," Jaggers observed of Drummle, "but true strength, that remains to be seen." Dinner ended. Wemmick accompanied me outside. In the solemn night, I asked of Molly's past. He paused, then spoke with care. "Years ago, she was tried for murder. Jaggers defended her. Her strength defended her. But the law let her walk free. She's served him ever since." My chest tightened as I realized. Estella's mother was here, hidden in plain sight. Wemmick watched me roster the truth. What passes between us stays between us. We parted at the street corner. His allegiance was unspoken but sealed. As I made my way home, hands chilled by revelation, I carried secrets heavy as stones woven between gratitude betrayal, and a quiet determination to speak only when truths could be trusted. The next morning, I made my way back to Satis house. My heart weighted with conflicted dread, part yearning, part dread. I had to face Miss Havisham again, knowing I had to accept what she offered and forgive. Inside, she was seated by the hearth, lean and lonely, close to the fire, as if both seeking and defying it. Her eyes widened when she saw me, fragile but earnest. "You came," she managed softly. I knelt beside her, voice tender. "Your note." "I came immediately." She nodded, tears brimming. "Tell me what you need for Herbert." I hesitated, then urged again, certain of the answer. She sniffed, searching for my gaze, then asked, "If I do it, will you keep my secret?" I looked at her, aching with empathy, and answered without hesitation, "Yes, it will ease my mind." Relief crossed her face. Then she pressed, "Do you forgive me?" Her voice broke. "You already have it." She fell to her knees, warmer tears cutting through her grief. "What have I done? What have I done?" She remained bowed, weeping and repentant. I told her I forgave her truly and that I did not blame her. My introspection had used up any room for judgment. She slowly rose and quietly wrote instructions on a note. When she finished, she gave me the slip and said softly, "Please let it pass through Jaggers. I can't bear another face looking at me." I assured her it would be done promptly. As I walked through the garden to calm the rush of grief and relief, memories crowded me, the faded joy of childhood visits. Estella reading behind the window, the whisper of lost hope. Suddenly, through the tall window above the brewery ruins, I glimpsed a flicker of amber Miss Havisham had moved too close to the hearth. I ran back, alarm in my chest, as her gown caught flame. She screamed, surging toward me in terror. Flames licked the air. I stumbled forward, pulling my coat around her, beating at the fire until it subsided. The gown lay in charred ruin. She collapsed in my arms, coughing, eyes vacant. I supported her through every anguished sound, aching with the knowledge of how deeply I cared. A surgeon arrived, frantic. He laid her out on the same waiting table she had once told me she would lie upon in death. He declared her injuries grave, likely more deadly from shock than the burns. Still, she lived ghostly in her ruined wedding dress. Through the long night, in delirium, "What have I done?" And every time Pip whispered, "You are forgiven," her tears answered in kind. I woke slowly, feeling the bruises across my arms, the soreness that spread from my charred coat. The fire had taken much, yet I survived. The room was dim, and Herbert hovered by my bedside, dressing the burns that traced across my shoulders. He spoke softly, deliberately. "You're blistered, but you'll make a full recovery. Keep still, let me tend to you." His hands were steady in their ministrations. I could barely answer. The events surged through me. Miss Havisham's collapse, the blaze, my own pain, all tangled into grief and relief. When the bandages were replaced, I finally forced words out. "Herbert, how is Magwitch?" He smiled gently. "He is improving in health and in spirit. Seeing you risk yourself for Miss Havisham changed him. He said I reminded him of someone he loved once, long ago." Curiosity and dread mingled in me. "And tonight?" He hesitated, then added, "Good news. My father's strength is waning. Soon Clara and I can marry quietly. I wanted to see you well before I spoke to her." Bittersweet. Then he leaned closer. "And Provis told me something last night about his past." His voice lowered. He had a wife, a jealous woman, a woman who killed another woman, and their child. He thought he had lost his daughter too. He hid during the trial to avoid naming her. A man named Compayson used that knowledge to blackmail him. And he said that you reminded him of what his daughter would have been. Pip, my breath caught. Estella. She is his daughter. I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle into me. The world did not shift. It cracked open. Estella, not Miss Havisham's only daughter, but Magwitch's child, born of a tarnished past, raised by fortunes cruel and estranged. This revelation changed everything. I turned to Herbert, voice hollow. It's more than I imagined. He nodded gently. Truly, it is more. A feverish restlessness seized me one morning, a burning need to know the full truth. I shared this compulsion with Herbert as we rowed slowly along the Thames, where the fog lay low like a silent witness. I must confirm Estella's parentage, I told him. Later, I found myself before Mr. Jaggers's office, heart trembling, arm still sore. Jaggers and Wemmick were poring over papers, the air sharp with business. Mr. Jaggers, I began, voice steadier than I felt. I carry Miss Havisham's note. I placed it on his desk. His sharp gaze lifted, flickered, and returned quickly to the papers. He arranged for the sum to be sent to Herbert with brisk efficiency. When the financial matter settled, I dared speak again. Sir, I know Estella's lineage. The words hit the room like thunder. Jaggers froze. Wemmick put aside his pen. The quiet crushed me. Go on, Jaggers said in measured tones. So I laid out the evidence, careful yet urgent, the story of Magwitch, of Molly, of Miss Havisham's child. Jaggers leaned back, expression unreadable. You are telling me the truth, he said at last. He glanced at Wemmick, whose face had softened faintly. Yes, Jaggers admitted. I don't know what to say. He sighed, then spoke of a case hypothetical, perhaps of a mother accused of murder who had a child she claimed she killed. He had obtained her acquittal, only on condition that the child go to a benevolent guardian. That guardian was Miss Havisham. He explained that we were better off with the truth hidden, for Estella, for Magwitch, for Molly. It would bring shame, not solace, to all involved. Wemmick shifted. He looked at Jaggers, then at me. Mr. Pip, he said softly, you have been candid on matters most keep secret. Let us protect this one for them. Jaggers nodded. And you, he said to Wemmick, keep your warmth for Walworth. I thanked him, voice hushed. As I left, the London fog felt different, clearer, yet more fragile. The secret weighed heavily in my pocket, but relief settled in my chest. I stepped out, not into home, but into a future shaped by what I now could believe. A pressing sense of purpose drove me to Little Britain. In my pocket rested the cheque from Miss Havisham, £900, to secure Herbert's position at Clarriker's firm. I met Miss Skiffins' brother, the accountant, who went straight away to Clarriker with the cheque. The arrangement was final. Clarriker then revealed that he was expanding into the Middle East, exactly the kind of venture Herbert would helm. Relief warmed me. I had completed something good, something lasting. Herbert listened, his eyes alight with hope as he painted fantasies himself, guiding Clara through eastern bazaars, me joining them by camel train, venturing up the Nile among ancient wonders. Their vivid images lifted me, even as my thoughts turned to what I was losing, my dearest friend and his dreams of Egypt. By March, my left arm remained tender and stiff, preventing me from buttoning my coat. The right arm served me, though scarred and sore. Over breakfast, one Monday morning, a note arrived from Wemmick. Walworth. Burn this as soon as read. Early in the week, say Wednesday, you might do that thing you know if you feel inclined. Now burn. Herbert and I memorized it, then watched it burn. Knowing I could not row, Herbert proposed enlisting Startop, trustworthy, enthusiastic, honourable, as our oarsman. He must believe it a harmless lark until the day comes, Herbert said of Startop. Then he'll know. We are getting Provis aboard discreetly. You in or out? I did not hesitate. Where will he go? Herbert asked keenly. It mattered little which port, be it Hamburg, Antwerp, or Rotterdam, as long as Magwitch, Provis, was safely out of England. We planned to slip him aboard a steamer downriver below Gravesend, beyond the customs scrutiny. With high tide aligned, we'd row at ebb, hide until the vessel neared, then climb aboard. Everything was prepared that Monday evening. Passports secured, Startop briefed, and logistics arranged. That night, entering our temple chambers, I found an envelope addressed to me and suspiciously dirty slipped through our letterbox. It had arrived after I left. In the days that followed, the river seemed colder, the looming plan darker. We waited. Wednesday approached, and with it, the moment to set our great escape in motion. Wednesday dawned grey and uncertain over London, the kind of morning where the air seems alert, waiting. I met Herbert at the usual spot near the riverfront. His face was drawn but determined. Every tremor of the oars felt freighted with consequence. At Clarica's, we removed Provis's sneaking clothes from a locker. Each garment was heavy in my hands, not just cloth, but a legacy, stained by fate and willed to disappear for safety's sake. Provis emerged still proud, though trembling with age and the weight of his fate. He shivered and hugged himself. I could barely meet his eyes. Wemmick appeared then, discreet and steady. Without judgment, he adjusted Provis's lapel and offered a reassuring nod. Between us, no words were needed. We guided Provis down the steps to Startop's small boat, each row echoing the drift of time. Little Britain shrank behind us. Herbert held the tiller. I clutched Provis's arm, our allegiance blood deep. The Thames shivered in morning light, mist clinging to the water like old regret. London's walls faded behind barges and rigging, distant and incapable of following us now. Below Gravesend, we approached a steamer preparing to depart. The engine's hum and the murmur of crew felt surreal. Startop and I steadied him. As he climbed aboard, Provis looked back, not with fear, but clarity. It was farewell. Once he disappeared from view, I stood rooted. The river's surface swallowed him, but the rebellion he ignited in my heart would stay lit. We returned in silence. Wemmick offered a knowing glance. Herbert grasped my shoulder, grateful and pained in one breath. That evening in our rooms, I counted the quiet hours. Provis was gone, but I was not free. His debts were carried by me now. Ethical knots, emotional toll. In the hush of my chamber, I retrieved Estella's letter from my coat, carefully saved until now. Against the candle's wavering glow, her handwriting looked small, and I knew that the price I paid to save one man had changed everything, even love, and the possibility of peace. The morning broke in a trembling silver over London, as if the city inhaled in anxious anticipation. Herbert and I prepared silently, our minds set on one goal: getting Provis safely aboard a steamer bound for freedom. Startop joined us at dawn, steady-faced and determined. Though my right arm still bore the stiffness of healing burns, I helped him push our little boat into the Thames. Provis Magwitch waited in Clara's small sitting room, calm but expectant, as though accepting whatever lay ahead. The Thames unfolded before us like a grey ribbon. We rowed with quiet strength, slipping past warehouses and docked barges, until the rising sun cast soft gold upon our path. At the appointed point, we slowed. Provis reached out, trailing his hand in the current, murmuring, "Like life, this once but free again." Masters of Valmon, we passed a filthy riverside inn and halted. Its worn sign creaked in the cold breeze. The innkeeper warned us of a four-oared galley prowling nearby, possibly customs, but his words floated more fear than certainty. We pressed on. Later, when our hopes seemed near, a steamer loomed in the distance, but so did the galley. Men burst forward, uniforms hidden beneath coats. One shouted for Magwitch's arrest. Panic snapped through us. Provis froze. Then he lunged, unveiling a face on the galley deck compasson. In an instant, they grappled and plunged into the river. The terror and splashing shook our boat. I watched helplessly as bodies struggled beneath the grey water. Moments later, Provis emerged, gasping, wounded. Compasson lay still lost to the water's depths. Startop caught first Provis, then me, pulling us aboard the galley. The men on board were ruthless. They bound Provis with chains, and every possession he carried, including the cash meant for his new life, was confiscated by the crown. As we turned for shore, Provis rested his hand on mine. "I have no money now," he whispered, voice ragged but resolute. "But your kindness is wealth enough." In that moment, all traces of revulsion vanished from my heart. I looked at him, not as criminal, but as man, and cried silently beneath that pale morning sky. Wednesday arrived under a sky veiled in restless grey. The trial of Magwitch approached, and with it, the looming certainty of his fate. First, I sought out Mr. Jaggers to request his powerful craft in defense of my benefactor, though in my heart I suspected it was a lost cause. Jaggers received me with his usual cool efficiency. He showed no surprise when I disclosed that Magwitch's entire estate would be confiscated, declared forfeited to the crown, including the money I cherished. He even expressed a hint of disappointment, frustration, that I had allowed the fortune to slip away before legal salvage was possible. Still, freedom weighed heavier in my mind than gold. Meanwhile, Herbert received news that he was needed in Cairo immediately to start a branch of Clarica's business. I was proud of him, but my heart clenched at the thought of losing him in that critical time. Then, Herbert surprised me. "Pip," he said gently, "there's an opening as clerk once I'm settled there. It may lead to partnership. Would you consider it?" His offer was generous, unexpected. But I needed time. "I must see this through," I answered. "I must stay with Provis for now." He understood. Then, a message from Wemmick arrived. "Walk with me this Monday. I'd like your company." I nodded, easily grateful for friendship amid the fragile chaos. Come Monday, Wemmick led me on a walk. Fishpole in hand, he steered us toward a small church. Beyond the door stood his orderly wedding ceremony, him and Miss Skiffins exchanging vows, the aged father giving her away. I found myself thrust in the role of best man. Afterwards, we repaired to a modest tavern where he removed his white gloves, her green ones replacing them. Over breakfast, he told me softly, "Let this remain, Walworth." He let the words trail. His private joy lifted the gloom of the morning. Back in the city, I learned that Magwitch's health had declined straight away. He was moved to the infirmary, where the end seemed near. I visited daily, watching his breath falter. When the trial verdict came, death, Magwitch barely registered it. Yet he smiled, grateful that I was there. Later, in that solemn moment when he lay dying, I whispered what mattered most. "Your daughter, she lives and is a fine lady. I love her." He kissed my hand with quiet departure. Magwitch lay in the prison infirmary, too weak from injuries to stand, his lungs ravaged, ribs cracked. Pip visited as often as allowed, gently reading to him Tennyson, Shakespeare, anything to bring light into those final hours. The trial proceeded regardless. Magwitch was found guilty, lumped in judgment with dozens of others. Before the judge, he stood unflinchingly. "My lord, I have received my sentence of death from the Almighty, but I bow to yours." That trembled in Pip's soul like a penitent's prayer. Desperate, Pip filed appeal after appeal, but the system refused to relent. Each night, he haunted official chambers in hope, but every door slammed shut behind him. As Magwitch's condition declined, Pip stayed by his side, washing his hands, cooling his fevered brow, whispering comfort. One weak morning, Magwitch's eyes brightened fleetingly when Pip leaned close. "Your daughter," Pip said softly. "She's alive, a lady, and I love her." Magwitch tried to smile. He grasped Pip's hand with shaking strength and whispered, "Thank you, dear boy." He slipped away, releasing breath, life, regret, and love into dawn's quiet promise. There was no last dramatic struggle, only the hush of gratitude. Pip knelt beside him. Outside, church bells fell in distant rhythms. Recalling a parable Pip once read, the proud Pharisee and the humble sinner, his voice broke. "O Lord, be merciful to him, a sinner." Tears met the stillness. Pip lingered until his presence filled the room alone, the convict gone, yet redeemed. After the death of Magwitch, I found myself engulfed not only by grief, but by a deeper, more physical frailty. I fell into a fever so intense that I could scarcely move. 2 creditors arrived, seeking to arrest me for a debt owed. But when they saw my condition, bedridden and delirious, they relented. I lay in a haze of hallucinatory memory. The wounded marsh, Miss Havisham's ghostly figure, Orlick's malicious laughter, and always. When consciousness finally broke through, Joe was there. Biddy had urged him to come. His face, calm and familiar, anchored me to reality. I stammered apologies, offering my pain, if only he'd stop being so kind. But Joe held me gently. "We've always been friends." His presence was balm. He tended me with unspoken forgiveness. In the lull that followed, he brought news from home. Miss Havisham had died. She'd left her fortune mainly to Estella and to Matthew Pocket. Hers was a reward born of Pip's belief in the man she'd once dismissed. Orlick, too, had been caught after robbing Mr. Pumblechook. His malice was paid back in jail. As I regained strength, Joe's manner shifted. Where once he'd called me Old Pip, he now addressed me as Sir. The change made me wonder, had I lost something irreparable in my transformation? I resolved to open my heart to Joe, but the next morning, he was gone. All that remained was a short note. "I do not wish to intrude." A receipt from Pumblechook lay there. I was even more ashamed to find Joe had secretly paid all my debts. Determined to make amends, I returned to my former home. I planned to confess everything, to ask Biddy to marry me, and rebuild what I had recklessly abandoned. I arrived back in my old village, carrying hope heavy in my heart. But the landscape had changed, not just in the seasons, but in the way people regarded me. At the Blue Boar Inn, the staff greeted me with polite distance, their smiles a hair's breadth from disdain. Satisfied, I observed how fortunes defined one's worth. Mr. Pumblechook soon appeared, as pompous and officious as ever. He delivered a condescending speech about my misfortune, the loss of my benefactor's wealth, and how it was my own ingratitude that had undone me. I bit back the urge to refute his self-serving pride. Soon I went to the forge, expecting to reveal important news and to propose to Biddy. But the door was shut, eerily still. The hearth was cold, the blacksmith's tools idle. Then, before me, stood Joe and Biddy, radiant and arm in arm. I froze. Today, of all days, was their wedding. Biddy, seeing my shock, embraced me with a warmth that stung. My own plans to propose vanished like mist. I fought tears. "Biddy, Joe," I began, voice cracking. "I never told you, but I came back hoping." They both stopped me gently. Joe, ever patient, replied, "You have nothing to apologize for, and if ever I had anything to forgive, God knows I do." Biddy added softly, "We're so happy you're here, Pip," said Henri Parnas. The moment cocooned us, love, loyalty, and forgiveness weaving through years of pain. I packed my few belongings and arranged my debts. At dawn, I left for Cairo to join Herbert at Clarica's firm, determined to work honestly and humbly. In the months to come, I settled into a modest but meaningful life, always keeping in touch with Biddy and Joe. Time passed. I became a third partner in the firm, worthy of trust and purpose. Herbert later learned that I had quietly enabled his career. Money I had thought lost had, in fact, been hidden from him until I could repay the gift of friendship. 11 years had passed. I had not returned to England in body, though always in memory. One December evening, quiet, frost-kissed, I hesitantly lifted the latch of Joe's forge door. Through the golden glow of the hearth, I saw him. Joe, pipe in hand, as hale and steadfast as ever, seated in his old place. Beside him, seated on my childhood stool, his son, little Pip. Joe beamed. "We named him Pip for your sake, dear old chap," he said warmly. "We hoped he'd grow to be a bit like you, and I say, he's well on his way." Something soft in my chest thawed. Next morning, I took little Pip out onto the marsh. He showed me from atop a certain tombstone the resting place of Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and Georgiana, wife of the same. The past and present met in that silent gesture. When Biddy later brought Pip's daughter into her lap, I asked gently, half in jest, half in hope, "You'll let me have Pip back someday, or at least lend him to me?" Her hand, warmed by the glow of marriage, rested in mine. It spoke quietly, no permission needed. She asked if Estella still lingered in my heart. I confessed that I had not forgotten, though the dream had passed. Still, in the silence, I knew part of me would always remember. That evening, I walked toward the ruins of Satis House. The brewery was gone. The walls leveled, only the garden wall remained. Ivy fresh upon familiar stone. The mist curled around the remnants, soft as memory. Moved by a need deeper than reason, I whispered her name. There, stepping through moonlight and mist, appeared Estella. She spoke softly, "I've often thought of you, but until tonight, this place always stayed away from me." Tears fell. "Bidden, this land is all I own now," she admitted. "It's been all that resisted me in my hardest years." We sat in shared reverence for what had been and what might still be. "I've thought of you too," I said quietly. "You were never absent from my heart." She nodded, in a voice softened beyond pride. "I've given you a place in my heart too." We rose, hand in hand, and walked from the garden together, stepping into the mist, and I saw no shadow of another parting from her. Thank you for strolling through today's stories with StorySeeker. If you also love classic literature, fairy tales, and endless adventures, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any journey. See you in the next story. Wishing you all the best.